morning, everyone. So, unlike Reverend Mills and Dr. Anderson, I don't know many of y'all. So, I'm Earl Johnson. I'm the City of Greenville's Economic and Community Development Director. And the reason why you don't know me is because I've only been here 15 months. Now, do not hold that against me. I've got some really big shoes to fill in Nancy Whitworth and the work that she did and City Council does on for the City of Greenville. That being said, I want to first thank Reverend Mills, Dr. Anderson, thank you guys for allowing me to speak. Tammy and your team, wonderful job, and I'm excited to hear FA and what he has to say today and the work that you're doing and your team as well. I'd love to share with you guys just a little bit about both myself and the City of Greenville. So I'm not from South Carolina. This is the 20th place I've lived at least 6 months or greater. Amen. My family doesn't want to move anymore, so hopefully we will be here a long time. So I'm a military brat, lived all over the world, and then have come to Greenville by way of Charleston, been there just over 14 years. So as you can imagine, if I was there for 14 years, my dad moved us around a lot when I was younger. Been doing economic development now 15 years. Excited to be here. Our community development department, if you do not know them, please reach out to them. They have a lot of resources available to you all to help, especially as it relates to affordable housing. And they do not do that alone. So I'll just name a couple partners. Well, it's going to be more than a couple, several partners that they partner with. Obviously, Community Works, and Tammy and her team play a very, very crucial and pivotal role in that, along with Brian Brown and his team at the Greenville Housing Fund, our foundation, and then some of our other nonprofit partners, Homes of Hope, Genesis Homes, Habitat for Humanity, United Housing Connections. Let's see here, Allen Temple, Rebuild Upstate, and there are others. And if you're in the room and you're a nonprofit and I miss you, I apologize. Bear with me again, 15 months. I'm trying to get the lay of the land while being here. What I would like to say is that City of Greenville, the council members take affordable housing very seriously. And so if you live in the city and you have a concern, a question, or a comment, please reach out to your city council member. They'd love to hear from you. Also reach out to myself or our team members so that we can pass that up our chain of command as well. It's so important that they built it into the 20-year comprehensive plan for the City of Greenville called GVL 2040. There are 3 pillars. The 3 pillars to that plan are affordable housing, transportation, and more, along Green Link, and then green space. But that is all clouded or encompassed in, and Reverend Mills says it, and so did Dr. Anderson, is that economic mobility for everyone. And so it is encompassed in all of that. So now is the time. And so I'll leave you with this, and then I'll turn it over to FA and his team, is this. So when I was 18, right, where was I graduating high school? My father gave me a card, graduation card, and right before, it's unfortunate his untimely death, within the card, he said, cherish my education. I was going off to college because only an act of God can take that away from you. So guys, listen intently today. Amen. And learn as much as you can. And we have the expert in the team here. Ask your questions, ask your questions, ask your questions, please. All right, so thank you very much. Turn it over to Tammy. Thank you.
Thanks, Merle, and welcome. Gotta get his mask. Find these everywhere, don't we, these days? Like yes. On the side of the road, like random places. Again, thank you. And I'm so excited for today. And as my fellow board members and partners said, and I'm excited that Ms. Rivers is here as well. And I know we've got folks from Anderson, Spartanburg, and Greenville today. And we thought we'd meet in the middle in Greenville. So thank you for those that traveled in from our other upstate partners. And looking forward to ongoing conversations around faith and development. I've been so fortunate to be able to work with F.A. Johnson over the years. Many of you may or may not know I started my career in Charleston in housing community development. back in the 90s. I know I don't look that old, but I am. And FA came into my life via Pastors, which was, at the time, I worked in the downtown area with a lot of the faith communities in the downtown area, and bringing all the different faith communities together to focus on economic and community development. We know that the faith community is essential to the work that we do, and so we're really excited to have FA here. FA has a long resume, having gone to law school at Emory, Morehouse. He's got a development background and a legal background, and a long family history of doing this work. And you will notice and note not only his experience and expertise, but his passion and love for this work, which is why I'm so honored to continue to work with FA.
Thank
so
you.
FA, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you. Good morning. Now, if for some reason you cannot hear me, please let me know. I tend to walk around, so I don't necessarily stand with the microphone. Plus, I get boring when I'm standing in one place. I am old school, being brought up in the AME church that, you got to start with protocol. So in this case, the shepherd of the house, Reb Stacy Mills, we appreciate you for being our host. Reverend Anderson, we appreciate bringing the word, and certainly the opportunity to collaborate and work again with Tammy and her staff. Her staff has been phenomenal and is phenomenal, so we certainly appreciate that. Now, also, just to, make sure I can get back in the house, I also want to recognize that I started out following my father around somewhere around 6, 7 years old, and so I have F.A. Johnson III. Can you wave your hand and say hello? Say good morning. And my oldest, Aunt Catherine, is back there, and I'm going to take 30 seconds and stick my chest out and have a proud papa moment. I went to a single A school, class of '86. I can't imagine being in a quad A school with 360 people in my class alone. So it is with great pride that she knows that I'm proud of her that being ranked 14 out of 360 some people academically. I mean, I say, I don't know, did those genes come from mama? Because I don't know that I can quite claim and hold on to that sort of. Historical context to the comments of where we are today and our conversation. We're at an interesting and a pivotal moment from a couple different perspectives. Nationally, from a cultural perspective, the emphasis on diversity, equity, inclusion provides an environment rich with stepping up and making the big ask, making the request, and being heard a little bit differently. At the same point in time, there's also this confluence that we're on what we hope is the backside and the downside of this pandemic. And if nothing, I think that the pandemic has impacted as it relates to our faith-based community is a realization about pivoting and change and being poised to adapt. And so part of my goal and objective here is I want to talk about changing our mindset. We can't talk about revitalizing the community if we're not prepared to revitalize our minds and our perspectives. And so I want us to look at how do we take our assets, because the churches hold land, they have buildings, those are assets, and how do we leverage those to move them forward. But the other thing that makes this also, I think, relevant and timely is the emphasis and recognition on having other streams of revenue. I can say that I think that this message falls differently now than it may have with some folks 2 or 3 years ago. But having those alternate streams of revenue is something that becomes super important. And so for me, I just want to just give you an understanding from my perspective of, I say, from my ministry, the anointing that I feel upon, that's been placed upon me in terms of my role and responsibilities. I have sat on every side of the table. I've been on the commercial lending side. I've been on the city side responsible for implementing projects. I've been the redevelopment director for the city of Roanoke to actually implement projects, and certainly having the opportunity to represent neighborhood groups, nonprofits, church-based groups, and even municipalities like the town of Hollywood to be their capital asset manager, to put in new town hall, library, pool context, just the breadth of that. But how do we translate that into a mechanism that we can then participate in the economic realities and benefits? So I take it as both a privilege and a responsibility to be charged to help shepherd some of those visions to move that forward. So with that, I really want to move into some of the expectations, goals, and objectives from that standpoint. Oftentimes when we start a service, when we enter the house of worship, it is not uncommon that we might begin with the perspective that hopefully someone who is a visitor that comes into that service might be impacted by something that is said or done in that service, and that they may leave differently than they came. Is that not fair? Okay. I want us to take that same approach today. If we're talking about something that you have not necessarily seen or heard previously, I want us to leave a little bit differently in terms of our perspective. So that's part of my goal and objective is I want to just make it real by walking through some examples. So it is both educational, there's also a little bit of inspirational, but at the end of the day, just as we might say from a faith perspective, we want to come in to worship and then leave to serve. I want us prepared to leave and move into action. Take that information, take those perspectives, and move into action. So that is my goal and objective, is that we can adjust and transform our mind and move into activation. The tone has already been set as it relates to economic development, empowerment, and how is it that we're going to move forward together? Because all too often, our faith-based institutions tend to work in silos, and there might be opportunities for us to walk across lines. If we're going to walk into the city, the Economic Development Office, Housing Community Development Office, that maybe if there are 2 or 3 of us that are walking in collectively, and maybe we still have our own projects, but we're making a collective ask. Maybe somebody's working on home ownership, someone else is working on multifamily, but we can all come in one accord and take our collective voices to the table as we make the ask. Because at the end of the day, it is about self-control, self-determination as we seek to move forward. So as we look at the difference between a stimulus and our response, it's up to us to make that choice of how it is that we're going to react and do that. And I need our churches, our leadership, to think and act in more business-like terms. I think one of the things that has actually hurt us, particularly in communities of color, is the fact that when it comes to, for example, tax returns, churches have a different set of requirements and guidelines in terms of reporting. But that also has hurt us because until we get into the development arena, we don't necessarily have the same focus on putting together our own finances, our own financial reports, until it's time to move forward with a project. And I can tell you that at the time that we're getting ready to move into a project, how many times I'm now waiting for a church to prepare their material as a part of that process. So we move into a conversation about the role of the church and the role of the faith-based community as it relates to community development. And so with that, I want to transition into some specifics. I said earlier, we tend to own a lot of property. How do we either develop our own property? How do we do acquisition to go out and acquire additional property? And how do we leverage that for economic benefit? Sometimes that requires us partnering in order to do that. And those partners not only are with other development-related entities, but look around the room. You have Community Works. You have a number of different municipalities represented and other nonprofits represented. You have trade associations represented, all of which can add some aspect and assistance as we look to move forward. So when we start talking about the different aspects of who do we need at the table, you have the resources here. And I want to just take a minute, because in case I don't say it later, having someone like Community Works at the table means you don't have to explain the industry. You don't have to have the conversations on affordable housing and the benefits. You can go straight into talking about the project and what you're trying to accomplish. And that takes so much off of the table because they understand this niche of what you're trying to accomplish. So with that, as we start looking at faith-based development, I do want to take a few minutes and talk about Pastors. Pastors Incorporated is more than simply a developer of affordable housing. It is a single conduit to pull together a number of different organizations and entities representing a number of different denominations. True enough, it grew out originally out of working in the downtown peninsula of Charleston, and then grew citywide, then into North Charleston, into Hollywood and the surrounding areas, and now moved into working statewide. The goal here is having the opportunity to apply for funds, apply for support, because at the end of the day, our churches may have a nonprofit status, but guess what? The cities, foundations can't fund saving souls. So when we ask the question, do we have a nonprofit? Yes, the church might be a nonprofit, but do we have a separate nonprofit that can be the vehicle to receive those resources and access those resources separately from the church body? The role pastors plays is for those that may, either by choice, don't want the administrative headache or are too small, it provides a separate independent entity that can be that connector and provide those resources and be a third party along the way. At the end of the day, I'm going to just walk through a couple of projects that Pastors has done, but I chose this particular slide because this house, in some form or fashion, we've built in 3 different jurisdictions. 3-bedroom, 2.5 bath, ranging from 1,300 square feet to 1,700 square feet as being the sweet spot. That is the sweet spot of the market. Now, I know we have a couple of real estate professionals. I'm gonna give you a time. Y'all tell me between Greenville, Anderson, Spartanburg, what is the sweet spot in this area? And when we get to another portion of dialogue, I want you all to think about and weigh in, because that's one portion that when we start talking about the church getting into development, we have to think market-driven. What are the market-based opportunities? Because that's the key to our success. I think understanding our market, and you'll hear me talk about this a little bit later, and civil engineering. Churches love, the first thing they want to hire when they start real estate is who? Who's the first person most time want to hire? Y'all can't be silent. This is interactive. We're gonna have a conversation. First person you want to hire typically is the you start building. Architect. Okay. This is part of that mindset change that I want us to start adapting. First person that I tend to hire is my civil engineer. I need to understand the dirt. I need to understand my water. I need to understand my sewer, because that is where projects tend to get awry. I'm not demeaning the architecture, but HVAC is engineering. Structural is engineering. The dirt, engineering. So I say that as a point of emphasis. So as we start looking at how do we get into it and how do we approach and tack into things. Not everybody is ready to purchase a house. So we need to be able to address the rental market, the rental component. And as we walk through these, I want to talk about what I'm going to call nuggets. Nuggets, takeaways, things that I want to leave in your spirit that you can take and apply based upon what it is that you want to achieve. So one of the items here, when we look at this, is look at the list on the funding source side. County money, town match, private financing, and the state. Typically, if we're talking about trying to achieve something that is affordable, and I'm going to get into a definition of what I mean when I say affordable, it's going to cost us more than what it's going to support. So how do we fund that? How do we still make it feasible and financially viable? And so there we have to look at those different subsidy sources. So you'll hear people use terms like lasagna of layering and layering of resources, but that's what they're talking about, is the fact that in order to make these things happen, it takes a number of different players and a number of different entities to come to the table to bring these to fruition. I will point out, and I want to come back to this for a minute, we just had this groundbreaking, it was either last week or the week before. I mean, not ground, but ribbon cutting. This young lady, 1,700 square feet, by going just outside of the jurisdictional limits and doing it in the bedroom communities, we're able to put her in the house cheaper than people are paying rent. Her mortgage, taxes, insurance, all in under $900 a month. Okay. So when we start thinking about where is it that we're located and what is it and how do we make these projects viable, we need to bring all the different tools and resources to the table that can impact us. Now, I want to park here for a while. I want to talk about New Israel Reformed Episcopal Church for a few minutes, because in my mind, they represent so much of what it is that we are trying to teach and impart and educate. I will say this. I went back to pull their 2019 numbers just to make sure for perspective. Of the churches, for those of you who are here who are willing to, well, let me back. If you have not noticed by now, I like dialogue and interaction. So don't make me call on someone. Let's volunteer as we have this exchange, because this is not a one-way street. This is a mutual exchange of information, all right? And if there is a question, thought, or issue that's on your mind, it's on someone else's mind. It's just whether or not they feel comfortable or the desire to speak up. So one of the questions that we did not ask in the surveys on the front end was the size of the congregations. But New Israel has, from 2019, they were reporting 79 giving units. How does that relate within this room? Give me some perspective of the size of congregations that were represented here. Someone large and someone small. Pastor, what your in general membership numbers you think in your congregation?
As far as giving units, maybe about 275.
275, all right. Anybody closer to 100? Okay, thank you. Okay, anybody under 100?
Yes.
Okay, all right. So part of the reason I wanted to have that conversation is realism. What I'm getting ready to walk through is not a mega church. Okay, that's the first piece, is that the size of your congregation is not necessarily determinative of the size of the project that you can take on. Okay, so I want to get that and address that first piece of it. The church made the decision early on to start acquiring any property that came available over the course of time surrounding the church. That was a long-term vision. So when we start talking about vision, was if property comes available, we, the church, are going to purchase it. All right. At the same point in time, when it came time to move into implementation, we had to start with something small. Because unfortunately, we talk about our faith and our belief, but sometimes, maybe it's not these churches, but some churches you still got to show me. You got to be Missouri. I got to show me in order to make it real. So it's a separate conversation. So, but when we start talking about the blind, may not necessarily mean pure blind sight. So as we start to bring sight, we want to have this conversation. So we started with a single rehab. The church had this property that's on the left-hand side of the top that was, they're cutting the grass, they're paying insurance on it, and it's sitting vacant, unutilized. And we came in to rehab that, and we put in a veteran and used HUD-VASH, which is basically Section 8 that's specific to veterans through the VA, as a point of beginning. Now, from there, we then moved to, and I'm just going to, Pastor, if you just take a, no, I just want you to take a look at that. I didn't make copies because I don't want to share folks' information, but I want you to flip to the second page and look at the lease amount on that. This is Montessori school that, now, unfortunately, my pointer on these monitors does not work, but this building along Simmons that's represented on this side is one of the buildings that they purchased. And they signed a lease with a Montessori school. That lease is several years old, so they're now down at the bottom number, which is, what is their monthly lease payment?
$8,500 a month.
$8,500 a month. They're bringing in $9,000 a month from the lease of the Montessori school. Now, why is that relevant? Would anybody like to have an extra $9,000 before you pass the plate? Yeah. Okay. My goal is I want us, irrespective of the tithe, to not have to rely on the chicken dinner, the spaghetti dinner, and the fish fry to raise some revenue. So if we can bring in $10,000 a month in some form or fashion, but now here's where the rub comes and I start to step on some toes. They are in an area that is gentrifying. That Montessori school, the leaders and the students do not look like this room. But the money is green. The checks clear the bank, okay? That is part of the thought process, is what can we do that is profitable? So when I start talking about daycare, it doesn't necessarily mean that we're having Sister Jones in the church running it. Too many times our churches that are running daycares are actually operating the daycare. Part of the thought process, this mental shift, this nugget that I'm talking about is, why not just collect the lease? Collect the lease payment and have a professional operator. But we, as a faith-based, can I just speak real, please? We do not want to pay people professionally. We want someone to volunteer. We want a committee. Write the check and bring in someone who can go out and solicit one of your national regional daycare operators to come in and write a check so that your sole accounting responsibility is to check the accounting on the books. Okay, so that's one piece of that. Again, there's several pieces to this, that one phase. That's why I said I want to park here for a minute. That's why I think this represents so much of what is relevant. Separate from that, we have the next house down here in the bottom corner. We did as market rate. Oh, I'm sorry, I left out a small detail, but we're doing it as market rate. Now, market rate, I'm going to talk and start doing all the definition on these, what these different terms mean, but meaning it is not subsidized. In fact, the way that, Brother Johnson, how did you finance that house? All right. The way we financed that house was we took that lease and we took it to a lending counterpart like a Community Works and said, we want to borrow against this lease. So we took that lease to, in this case, it was Synovus, borrowed the balance that was owed on the church and took out enough extra to rehab this house. So now there's another $1,200 a month coming in off of this house. And the church is free and clear. That sounds like a place for a hand clap for me. I don't know about y'all. If you're talking about mortgage. Okay, so the church is free and clear, and the lease is paying, servicing the debt service. And because we then took that part of that money to then use to purchase, to rehab this house, now we have another stream of income. Now we're currently working on the next one up, going up the street, is a quadruplex, 3 bedrooms, 2.5 baths, 4 units. Now we're in the midst of putting that together. That is going to be a combination. I mentioned the first one being we use subsidy as a part of that. This is going to be a mixture between market rate and subsidized to kind of balance, because part of my thing is we need to serve, but some of you who've been around me know I say no money, no mission. So we need to think about both service and profitability. Okay. Yes, ma'am.
Do you use subsidy for development or subsidy for the end user?
Thank you. Excellent question. The question was, do we subsidize the development or the end user? Okay. So in this case, with the quadruplex, we're subsidizing the development itself. We're going to the city to obtain funds to lower how much we're going to have to borrow. And I'm going to go through another specific example with numbers to have that conversation. But since Ms. Franklin asked that question, I really want to also, again, another nugget in perspective, because I need you all to be stewards to go back to the rest of your congregation. All debt's not bad debt. Because we say we don't want to borrow money. But if we're borrowing money that is going to leverage and bring in $10,000 a month, that is good debt. But we are not shy when we say we're going to go borrow $1.2 million that we need to pass the plate to pay the mortgage off. And I get more resistance on the first than I do on the second. Okay? So we're shifting the way that we approach and tie into this. Now, unfortunately, this quad would already be under construction, but as most of you may know, in this late COVID environment, construction prices have gone berserk. Okay? And so we're trying to now, our gap has increased substantially, so we're trying to figure out how we're going to fill that. Yes, sir.
You asked a question about subsidizing the development. What you doing?
Yes.
You also talked about subsidizing the end user. The subsidy for the end user may come from a different source.
That is correct. The subsidy for the end user may come from just, can I get away from that, Mike? Can you two in the back, can you hear me okay from right here? You? Good? Okay. All right. So the first house I referenced was a combination of the two. By using the HUD-VASH, that Section 8 certificate helps pay that rent, but we also subsidize the house. So in that case, we did both. So when we start talking about those resources, what is it that we are looking for and how is it we're going to apply to do that? And so it becomes a very important piece of how do we move forward in terms of financing debt versus grant resources. And I will say I have had true arguments over that point. State Housing has changed their program, but there was one point where you could apply for either a grant or a 1% loan. And I will tell you as a professional, the difference between those meant whether or not you got 0 points on that question on the application or 25 points on that application. And yet I have had folks argue, say, no, we want a grant. Well, I'm here to tell you 1% over 30 years is a grant. Okay? Okay? That is effectively a grant. So we have to think about how is it we're going to tack into with it. And especially if, and I have another specific example I want to walk through to show you the difference of what that means economically. And then lastly, the building up on the corner in the top right is a commercial building that has a commercial kitchen, and we're now moving to the phase of trying to see, can we get a traditional commercial tenant, Subway, Starbucks, something along those lines, excuse me, to come in as a tenant. Can you give me some water, please? As a part of that. So with that, leveraging those assets to where it takes the stress and the burden of the operations off of the church and provides a mechanism for paying salaries and other items along those lines. Gentrification may not necessarily be a bad word if you can figure out how to twist and turn that to your advantage and leverage to that improvement. Okay, so those are some of those pieces there. Questions, thoughts, or issues before I move from here. But I think this is the example, one of the examples of economic empowerment at the grassroots level. Again, a church of membership and of roughly 100 folks, giving units around 79, and I want to make sure, give me 1 second, I'm going to come to you 1 second. But I also want to make sure, if I start using terms that we're not familiar with, please stop me and let's have a conversation. How many of you actually understand what I mean when I say giving units? Or who does not? Do I need to? Well, somebody tell me, what is a giving unit? And what's the difference between that and membership? Oh, wait a minute now. Oh, I thought we knew. Oh, thank you. Okay. Giving units is not membership.
And what I have found, a lot of folks, when they hear giving units, they think every member is a giving unit. But
thank you. Say that again. Thank you. Please say that again.
And because you're on the roll and you're not giving, then you're not a giving unit.
Okay. A husband and a wife is a single giving unit. A husband, wife, and a child is a single giving unit. So if I sit here and I come in, even though he is knocked out, the three of us as 3 members, that's one giving unit. And why does that matter? One slide I did not put in here, but I will certainly share as well, or underwriting criteria of how banks use to make a decision as to how much they will loan the church. And one of those mechanisms is giving units, because they look at the relationship between your total debt and your giving units. Because if one house goes down, saying you have 3 members, but now the wife is trying to make up for the husband's salary, she is no longer writing those checks to the church. So the financial institutions look at those as giving units. Give me one. I promise Miss Loretta, and then I'll come. Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
In this contest, are you going to show anything that less dense population? Are you going any?
Okay. Okay. I do have 2 examples in here that are less rural, and I will say I am using some fairly dense examples, but the principles remain the same. And in our rural areas, again, I start off with that example with USDA. You actually might have more tools in your toolbox than somebody that is in a municipality, or I shouldn't say more. You may have additional tools in your toolbox that someone in a municipality may not have. But we're talking. Yes, sir.
If you have grown children that have a separate house.
That's correct.
That's considered too big to give.
That's correct. Yes, that's correct. Yes, ma'am.
Question, in a sense, is there a proximity restrictions? If your church is in one area, are you having to build only around that area, or do you have some flexibility?
She reading my notes. I haven't even gotten there yet.
Oh,
Yes,
I'm
ma'am.
sorry.
No, I'm just kidding. No, please, no. Don't stop, please. Keep, and that is a very point. That is another one of my items. I really actually meant to say that as it relates to this Montessori school. We tend to think that we are going to develop in and around the church, and we do want to be an anchor in the community. But if the market demand is elsewhere, then let's follow that demand. And I'm going to give you an example. The daycare that I used for a period of time with my son, we physically were at the daycare that was housed in the church. But down by I-77, a few miles down the road, they had purchased another existing daycare because that's where the suburban market was. But at the same point in time, think about it this way as well. The daycare does provide a service, but it's also another outreach. It is another form of ministry. It is another recognition that XYZ church name is associated, owns, and it raises your level of visibility. So one of my cautions is I ask folks to not be limited geographically simply around the church. If there are other opportunities, then let's do that. And somewhat to the question I think that Ms. Loretta asked is that there may be some other opportunities, especially when we talk about larger development, because that is one of the next things that I want to talk about is the size and the scope. Please do not shoot the messenger, but oftentimes our vision is smaller than the opportunity. And we need to raise our vision and our objectives. There is, I can't call the name, but there is a mega church that most of you would recognize and know that opted for, instead of doing an $8 million assisted living facility, decided to build a separate campus on the other side of town. And from a ministerial perspective, I understood that decision. But as a business person, it's hard for me to understand creating an asset that's going to throw off $100,000 a year in cash flow that's going to pay a whole lot of salaries to the church. So timing also factors into that. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, and then your approach to, and my question is, you said that financial institutions are going to want to know how many giving units that you have. What do they ask anything about the community and the span of where you serve?
Yes. And so the second part of when we start getting into the actual making the ask and applying for loans and that sort of thing, we'll talk a little bit more about those aspects. But yes, the church history, the history of the pastor, the neighborhood that you're serving, the community that you're serving, your goals, that's all part of that storytelling that we have to do. Yeah, very much. Okay. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
I don't want to interrupt your flow, but I don't know that that's an appropriate time to ask this question. But you have a number of churches.
Yes, sir.
The membership is getting older. And convincing that membership that this is a process that's worth jumping off into. In other words, a number of them are skeptical about forming a nonprofit and that nonprofit taking over the church, getting into an arrangement like this, and the entities that you partner with, they're interested in taking over that church or acquiring that land. How can you explain a little bit about the relationship between a nonprofit that the
Yes.
church would develop and how that is not threatening to the church body?
Okay. No, excellent question. If the church is looking at forming a nonprofit, how does that relate to the church, and particularly in the context of an aging congregation that may have some skepticism? And well, first of all, when I talked about earlier about COVID and the pivot, if we can be realistic, how many folks pre-COVID, especially in our older congregations, were reluctant about technology in the church? Using PayPal, using some other way of collecting money. I want to write my check and I want to put it in the plate. But when you can't get to the plate, how do you collect it? And if we didn't have the infrastructure in place, so it is a part, and it does require patience because we internally have to address that. And so there's the comfort level, because from an old school perspective, let's step aside from the church. I think about my grandmama kept that deed to that property. And I'm like, Mama, it's recorded at the courthouse. I'm not worried about it. No, this is my deed right here. Okay, so from that standpoint, now, as the lawyer in me says, you don't want those boards to be identical to, depending on whether it's the vestry, the stewards, the trustees, the deacon, whatever that governing body may be. But you want to make sure that that governing body has control over it, so that that's a part of your bylaw structure, making sure that the bylaws recognize that it is a wholly owned, controlled subsidiary to the church, and that the church appoints the governing of the board members. Now, at the same point in time, and I'm just going to be real today as much as I can, you can't control if you got a fool on it, and you appoint the wrong person. Don't act like, okay, thank you. So you need to be mindful of how you're staffing that board as a piece of that. But we have to be comfortable that even for the sake of liability, I don't want 100 kids in this daycare and it's holding in the name of the church. I want a layer of protection. And so that's part of that conversation on the front end, is to say, we're going to make sure that we protect this so that there's not a takeover. And that's where now, from a partnering standpoint, it becomes a challenge. I'm going to come to you 1 second. And here is where we unfortunately then are going to miss out on one of the largest opportunities to truly make some money, is on the low-income housing tax credit spectrum. Because the very nature of the low-income housing tax credit structure of putting up those apartments, which is just a multifamily tool that is not, it's not a HUD program, it's an IRS program, if you will, low-income housing tax credits. Because in order to syndicate, let's substitute syndicate for sell, to get those dollars, we have to give up 99.9% control for a 15-year compliance period. We can include a first right of refusal to buy it back, if you will, on the back end, but that is a part of that structuring. And just to speak plain English for a couple minutes, let's say that we need $5 million to do this apartment complex. And someone over here has a tax liability of $5 million. And the U.S. Treasury says that we can syndicate those tax credits for 70 cents on the dollar. So they want that $5 million tax credit, and they'll pay, just to make my math easy, $3.5 million for it, that they can then write as an investment into the project for which we need money. Now, I'm grossly oversimplifying a very complicated process, but what I'm saying is that there are certain mechanism programs which will allow the dollar stream to grow tremendously in relation to what it is that we're trying to achieve. But that inherent structure does provide to the average congregation a high degree of risk, because they are physically giving up control of that parcel during that 15-year compliance period. After that compliance period, you then have the right to reacquire it, if you will, when that tax credit buyer investor rolls out. But and unfortunately, that is one of the most profitable mechanisms. And right now, I don't want to get into this today, but South Carolina is in a mess right now, because this is the first time that we have exceeded our bond cap authority for those type of transactions. And that's a 2-hour conversation in of itself. Yes, sir.
I'm excited about this program, but my question is not a negative one, it's just one that I see as a reality.
Yes.
Many of the churches in the surrounding area are close to the central business district, which means that they are what? Landlocked, so to speak.
Amen.
That means that you're not going to get that profit or you couldn't afford it. Others, where most of us come from to go to church, in predominantly black areas, they have already been gentrified, if I can use that term.
Yes, sir.
Which means that it's going to make our job harder.
Amen.
To find affordable properties to rehabilitate or to build. Are you following me, sir?
Amen. Yes, sir. I'm right with.
I'm not negative here.
You're not. You're being realistic.
I mean, really. How can we, do you bring in a realtor at some point in time to help you find these properties? If we get into this, how do we make this work?
Sure. Okay. So, first of all, just as I make some comments, and I understand your question, and I'm gonna respond to that. But just as I say, when I say I'm being real, I want to say you're not being negative. You're being direct. And sometimes we have to have uncomfortable conversations because if we're not willing to have uncomfortable conversations, we're not going to move the needle. So for Pastors itself, Pastors Inc., I said, started on the peninsula of Charleston, the empowerment community. But the pricing pressures in downtown Charleston are such that the organization can no longer survive working there. And so then we started branching out to North Charleston, Charleston County, Hollywood, Berkeley, Dorchester, and now the state, because that's the only way for us to survive. And one of the things that, if you were around me long enough, I will always refer back to is, think back to when you the days when we were comfortable boarding an airplane. During that pre-flight ritual, the flight attendant says, if you are with someone and they become incapacitated and the oxygen mask drop, what is the instruction that is given? Put yours on first before you try to help someone else. We as a church have to think the same way. In order for us to minister, we have to make sure that we are financially feasible and viable. And that may mean that we need to reach out beyond where our immediate boundaries are. So yes, we need to bring in a professional who understands and help us find those opportunities. But it may mean that we also may have to go somewhere else to make the money to come back to have. It's been over 16 years. She's 16, so it's been over 20 years. I was working with a church downtown Asheville. We're looking at a condo project. And market rate condo, and the church leadership was like, why do we want to get into market rate condominiums? Because it's extremely profitable. About 3 or 4 years after that, and I happened to read the story about them shutting down their after-school program. If we had done the condo project and were flush with cash, we could continue to operate the after-school program. So we have to think from a business-like perspective, how do we generate those revenues to come in to fund what is near and dear to our heart? I'm going to go 1, 2, 3. Well, I'm sorry, 1, 2, 3. Yes, sir.
You kind of touched on where my question stems from. I'm in my 3rd pastorate. Previous pastorate, I won't be specific, but previous pastorate, here in Greenville, for instance, a lot of churches have pastors who have the vision to do what you're talking about. They don't have the authority. So, like you talking about the situation in Asheville, how do you get around the situation where the pastor has the vision, but you have individuals on the deacon board, the trustee board, and I don't believe in boards, I believe in ministries, but you have those people on those boards, they have a different mindset. So it's going to be it's difficult sometimes to get them to understand stepping outside the box. This is truly stepping outside the box for some ministries. Have you run into that? How do you navigate?
You say, how many times have I run into that? Was that your question? Was that?
Have you been able to navigate around? Because you have to go past the pastor to convince those individuals to support that vision.
Yes, very much so. And I will say, I was going to actually talk about this Wallingford project, and I can tell you the fights that we had to get that project done were not with the funding sources. They weren't with the city. It was internal. Right. And I had to actually have Mr. Merle Johnson's counterpart come into the leadership of the meeting and say, if you don't want my money, I'm taking it somewhere else. And that was the funding source, was the only way to get them to go ahead. Now, at the same point in time, I don't think I have it on here, but if I showed you the picture of the ribbon cutting, you would never thought we had them fight, because it was so packed. Everybody was in for that photo for that ribbon cutting. Okay.
So you will come in and assist that.
Correct. Yes, we come in, and that is a key piece. And let me say this: I would love to. People a lot of times talk about what FA pulled this off or FA got this, but when you look at the successes, whether it was the pastor or some key person in that organization, someone with a strong leadership to say, this is something that must be done, and to help it. It takes a position of strength and leadership to push that, because unfortunately, the African American church is blessed with a broad spectrum of the experience, economically, academically, professionally, okay? And matter of fact, I'm just going to say it this way, and again, and if I'm coming too raw, y'all, please let me know. But the African American church is one of the few institutions where a custodian might also be in charge of a $500,000 budget.
That's right. That's right.
But does that person have, and I'm not doing any perspective, I'm just saying that, but if you don't have the depth that you have a business person that's also on the finance committee, then it's going to inflect your perspective. So that's why as I try to teach through examples, because showing folks what's possible helps to fight the I don't see it, because it's hard for someone, just like we talk with kids, it's hard for someone to aspire to do something that they've never seen, that they've never been exposed to. So we have to expose them to that so that they can see and understand that this vision is real. And matter of fact, I want to tell you the truth. And he's going to kill me one day for telling you this, but I say it all the time. The day that we were waiting for Mayor Riley to show up to cut the ribbon on this house, the senior warden of the vestry got there 20 minutes early. We were putting the ribbons up. We were waiting for the mayor to come in the press and what have you. And he walked off and he looked at me and said, Johnson, when you and your daddy showed up, I thought you were full of it. But you pulled this off. And I'm sitting there with him in the room. I've quoted him. He said, yeah, I said it. Okay. I mean, but it's just real is that, you know, it sounds like hocus pocus. It's something that we can realistically do. Those sorts of things. So yes, sir.
You kind of hit on it, and I'm gonna be quiet.
No, sir.
But being able to show a congregation or the leadership of that congregation projects, and not just projects, but places where this has happened and it's been successful, I think also to help. You know, for instance, and I know you're familiar with them, they have that nonprofit over in Augusta that has a zip code for that name. You have the one in Aiken that has done a lot of housing. You have Brookline down in Columbia. Being able to show some successful nonprofit church relationships like that
Yes.
can help alleviate that.
Correct. And you got one Pastors Inc. too, as well. But I'm with you. I get your point. But you have to. I mean, it is about, you have to show that. You have to be able to show and demonstrate that, because there is the reluctance. Let's again. What is the real reluctance? The reluctance at the end of the day is really fear. The fear of the unknown, skepticism, and that doubt. And that's why it's tough for me from a faith standpoint that we talk on Sunday morning about the substance of things hoped for.
It's not all housing. It's economic
Okay,
development.
it's about economic development. Okay, and we're starting off with. I haven't even gotten to the economic development pieces, but okay, I had 1, 2. Yes, sir.
If I were to ask for a workshop in our church,
Yes, sir.
the question's gonna come up, how much startup money am I gonna pull out of our treasurer, who's
Amen.
half of it?
How much you gonna get paid?
Yes,
And how much is it
where
cost?
does that seed money come from?
See, I've had this conversation before. In case you hadn't, I've had this. Well, and so one of the things that we want to talk about, that seed money piece, a lot of times, whether it's true economically, whether the question becomes, well, we don't have the money. And I'm going to show you quantitatively the difference between not having the money and having the money. And matter of fact, hold on, bear with me. So let me, I want to jump forward for 1 second. Yes, sir.
I wanted to chime in right there with what you're saying too, because what we found in our church is that we might not have had the money in the church coffers, but the people in the pews had the money.
Amen.
And we implemented something called cooperative economics, and every piece of property that we purchased was purchased with cash from the congregation.
Okay. All right. So there are different aspects of how we do that. And so I also want to piggyback from that and something I was going to touch on later, but I'm going to go ahead just right now because we're here. And when we think about the resources, and I use the word capital, we think about money. When we start talking about capital, we're talking about money. But what Pastor just shared with us is a reminder that there are different types of capital. There's human capital, there's intellectual capital. We have those resources. You have these partners that are capital. So in this, the example that you just used, you're using your human capital to tap into resources that are not in the church's treasury as a form of doing that. So we have to think about and change our mindset in terms of what that definition of capital is. But I also want to be more pragmatic too. Do you see that? I'm told I'm colorblind. Yellow house, and what's color in front of it? Green? All right, those are 2 duplexes. Each one has a unit down and a unit up. And again, now I know I was asked about more rural examples, but Charleston being high density, I'm showing you some fairly dense examples. But these 2 properties, I think, highlight the difference and tell the story that I've been trying to explain for years in a very simplistic way. How many of you believe, that are willing to raise your hand, that we may not have the money to go into this venture in some form or fashion? Anybody who's willing to say that? Okay, thank you. I appreciate that. Okay. So, this nonprofit, and I was their project manager, went to build these 2 buildings. And they went to the city to pay for the professional fees, the civil engineering, the architecture, subsidize the construction. Part of the city's requirement is, because they use home funds in it, is that we have to serve 65% of the area median income. And I'm going to show you, I picked Greenville, but I'm going to show you Charleston and Greenville as examples in terms of what that means in terms of mortgage buying power and lease buying power. But when we say we don't have the money, here's the impact of that. And hopefully you can see it on those screens. But I took this out of the appraisal. This is the appraisal of these 2 houses. It says, as proposed, without rent restrictions, without that, $1,020,000. Can somebody tell me what the value is with the rent restrictions? Can somebody read that number? $670,000. So those houses sitting there today have an appraised value of $670,000 because they use city money. Now, let me be clear. I am an advocate of affordable housing. I am a proponent of affordable housing, and our people need a variety of levels of income. But at the same point in time, when we talk about the church being viable and convincing our seniors to take on a project like this, we are giving up, anybody do the difference between those 2 numbers? $350,000. That's the cost of OPM, other people's money. Would we have been better to go and borrow that money and have an asset that is worth $1 million, or go use the city's resources and have an asset that's worth almost $700,000? Now, is Ms. Hoyer one of the lenders in the room? Okay, so typically if I wanted to borrow against an asset, 75% maybe loan to value? You'll go higher than that? 80%? All right, so now you're not going to get that at the retail bank, but let me correct. Okay, 350,000. I'm going to split the difference with Tammy. I'm going to say 80%. $350,000, 80% is $280,000. So let's say, for example, there's a catastrophic event at the church. Storm comes in, need a new roof, something happens that we need to put our hands on cash. If I split the difference between Tammy's number and my number, that's $280,000 of borrowing power that you can just walk in with your deed and say, we need cash today, right now. You can borrow $280,000 less because you use someone else's money, because most likely the congregation said, we don't want to borrow that money, we want to go get a grant. Got a phone call Thursday night. I'm dropping my son off at football practice. Pastor calls me. We have a duplex free and clear. It needs some rehab work. I want to see if we can get a grant. I respect the position, but my point in showing you this example is you are giving up substantial value by doing that. Now, there is a place and a role that, and everybody's not in the same situation. But I just show that as one example, one nugget, a takeaway is that for you to ask the question for what's right for you, your congregation. I mean, it's no different than the house. I got to know what's right for me and my household. So for you and your house, what is correct? And it may be, to Mr. Gardner's point, it's less fight to get it started, to go use other people's money and show that it works, and then come back and do something as a market rate. But if you are blessed and you have people who have some other folks who have different experiences in the leadership, and you can talk about doing something that's more of a market value, I'm just trying to show you. I said I want to quantify them. I want to try and make it real. I want to talk pie in the sky. Now, here's one of my other things now. Am I correct? There's enough. Well, how many people, I guess, we had to not start off the distinction, but how many folks are actually clergy versus lay people? What clergy? All right. So for my clergy folks, help me out. Did Jesus use parables? You think so? Okay, one or two. Okay. For me, as a finance person, a non-church, as a non-clergy person, to me, a parable is a story with a specific meaning. I'm walking through, step by step, several projects to show you specific stories, to give you specific meanings for what it means of how you can apply in your own house and what that means and the ramifications. So it may be that depending on the congregation, and I forgot, tell me your name again, please, sir.
Ray Martin.
Martin, Brother Martin, that it may make sense to go and have a conversation with the city or the county and seek those resources before using the church resources. But that's an internal piece. And it is important that we have our own conversation. I don't mean to have my back to you, but I feel so far, I told Tammy at the beginning, I said, just like school and church, man, folks start at the back and they leave the front up. So I said, I got to come to you. I got to come into your house. That we got to do what's right for our own individual. Yes, sir.
Risk.
Risk tolerance is what we're talking about.
That's what we're talking about. Market rate risk versus grant risk. Grant risk is minimal. Market rate risk has a dollar value. How do you minimize market rate risk?
So, and I'm going to say what he said slightly differently. It's different to take risk with, well, can I use my 16-year-old, okay? She is happy when we roll up to get into my pocket. But when I say I need you to pay for it, I'd rather spend your money. Am I wrong? Okay, no, yeah, she'll tell me in a minute. Okay, so it's easier to go and say, Merle Johnson, we want to spend and put your money at risk than the church. So our perception is that it's less risky, okay? And so that weighs into it. And so if we believe that we're in a headwind when it comes to the congregation, that may mean that we need to pursue that route as a partner. Yes, ma'am.
Well, okay, what I was thinking when the gentleman mentioned that is, we have our friends here with the county as well, Catherine Rivers, but is compliance.
I was going, yes, ma'am. I was going there.
Grant side, compliance, we got rid of.
So and because at the end of the day, once we use those monies, we have to demonstrate. And there is this word, Ms. Rivers, that I'm sure she would utter, is called recapture. Recapture. Do I need to define that? Are we good? Okay. All right. And so we have to use, okay. But if we set out and we say we're going to serve 5 households and we do not do it, the city or the county may at least have the legal right to come back and get those dollars and ask for those dollars back. Or maybe a percentage. You only serve 2 people instead of 5. We need 2/3 of that money back. Okay. And so there is, but there's a difference in terms of that perception of that risk. And so that compliance piece is a factor that we have to take into consideration as to how we do it. Sir?
Final question to that. If, to help you fast forward the process you're in, can I house this LLC, this nonprofit, in my existing facility and allow them to pay rent to the church?
Amen. All day long.
Okay.
All day long. Matter of fact, look, just to be real, there's a difference between putting your business in the street and telling your story. I want to come over here and tell a story. I was presenting at a state housing conference 10 years ago when Gianna Shaw Johnson came and saw me present, and she asked me to come and take over pastors. The day I walked in, I was hit with 3 foreclosure notices. Literally. Okay? So I took the organization out of the ICU into the hospital to rehab financially. Okay? Part of that by, instead of doing acquisition, working with the existing churches to leverage their properties is a part of that. Why do I say that? It goes to your point, of course, that we have to look at this progression of our own financial capacity and ability of what the church can take on, what they're willing to, and how do we get into compliance. So part of that was we created a subsidiary, sold property to ourselves, mortgage, and then took back leases. So sometimes we have to be creative about how we go about doing that. And so we can enter, just like we can enter into a lease with a third party, we can enter into a lease of a related party. It's just a matter of lining up. So, for example, what does that really mean? Maybe there is money to run programs. And that program is being run by the subsidiary that then takes that program money and pays lease back to the church. There may not be money for the construction, but if you can run the operational side of it and then take that money in and then use that to pay rent, because that is what I think Ms. Rivers and Mr. Johnson would call administrative operations, correct? Okay. Okay. So we have to look at how we, and so that might be built in part of that structure as to how do we go about doing that. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, this may be a little bit off subject, but it's about a vision of a community where the community, like affordable housing, a lot of times people might go into those affordable housing but cannot get daycare or some type of job. So what about a community where you would have affordable housing, see if there was funding for a training center, see if there was funding for a call center, something that they could walk in walking distance of the affordable housing unit that these people may live in.
Yes.
So what about some kind of vision like that? Is that something that could be, I guess, funded, a training center?
Yes.
There is a problem with workforce right now.
Correct.
Like I said, it's a little bit off subject.
Okay. No, it's not. It's
Talking
not.
about
We are talking about economic
Community.
empowerment, economic development. And to be honest with you,
Yes.
the broader the vision, the easier it is to get funding, because what you're talking about is a comprehensive approach.
Exactly.
Housing is one, poor housing is symptomatic of a larger issue. Low wages, so if we can address the wage pool, then we're addressing the wages. The housing means that someone can be housed in the meantime, okay? So we have to look at that holistically in terms of what is it that we're trying to accomplish, and we weave that in, and that's where partnering comes in. For example, when I was going to transition to Wallingford, 180 Place is moving statewide, so their service area is being known more often. But as providing a transitional housing for homelessness, they have counselors, and part of the question was where they position those counselors. So when we start doing veterans housing, one of the things that I just threw out to the CEO was, suppose you get your counselors off-site and come lease these Sunday school rooms that are sitting empty Monday through Friday when you're meeting with your clients, and you come pay a lease to that. And they were excited to do that. Number one, because it puts them in touch with the church. The church, it's revenue for the church, but it's service. It's part of those other items. It's not beyond housing. And I want us to look beyond housing. That's why I'm talking about daycare, assisted living, retail development.
They're doing exactly that development in Augusta, exactly what you're saying. It's what they're doing in Augusta.
So I was going to so I was mentioning this about the project. Just real quickly, looking at how we leverage our assets, I just want to put this here. And unfortunately, with these monitors, my pointer is not going to work on there, but right next to where it says Wallingford, and you have that house that sits up at the front, the question became as a way of looking at, we need to do something about this house. It was boarded up, it still actually is, which is a different story I'll tell you about. How do we go about doing that? Well, if you look at where that blue structure is behind there, to me, vacant land is an opportunity, is an asset. So we could immediately come in and drop 4 units of veterans housing right behind on existing vacant parcel and start a revenue stream. But how do we get there? Which comes back to that whole point about leveraging and partnering. The church's property whether it's debt or not, is an asset. And from a business perspective, someone like a Community Works then wants to know, what is the value of that? Because when you say we don't have the money, you can walk into the county, the city, and say, I may not have cash, but I have land. So we assigned a value to that. We said, in this case, Wallingford, and I just took off tax roll, just don't look at it, $55,000. And I took that land and I went to the city and said, I need you to match it. And the city put in $60,000. Wells Fargo was looking to put some money somewhere, so they gave another $50,000, which we then took their $50,000 as foundation money and went to Wells Fargo Foundation. So we started stacking our cash to the point to where we had half of the project costs in non-debt sources that were grants. You would call it a grant, things that did not require repayment. That then allows those 4 units to cash flow to the church. And while the church leadership may not have been sophisticated in real estate, they quickly understood that as long as they had 3 bodies in those units, it was throwing off cash. That piece came real clear, real quick and fast. So when we start thinking about our capital and our assets, remember, we have our assets, but how do we leverage them? And another key piece here, let's talk about nuggets and takeaways. We're talking about, well, I want to go to the bank. TD Bank, Wells Fargo Bank. That is the financial side of the house. There is the TD Foundation. There is the Wells Fargo Foundation. Just like Home Depot, there's the Home Depot Foundation. What is the philanthropic arm of your organization? And being comfortable to ask that question, because you walk in, well, I want to know what the bank can do for me. Well, maybe it is not the bank itself, but its sister entity, the foundation. And you get to the cycle that you start to know and learn what these cycles are. And right now we're in a good time frame. The end of the year is always a good time as they start to restack their budgets for the next fiscal year. So when we start talking about the fact that right now, those are the real estate folks talking about the fact that Federal Home Loan Bank is out of down payment assistance money. That doesn't bother me because they're going to replenish it next year. So by the time I get these projects out of the ground and I time them, we get them in line. But knowing when the time is to ask. City of Charleston, Charleston County, North Charleston, I can tell you, January is application season. What's application season in Greenville and Spartanburg? September in Spartanburg. So we need to know what those cycles are so we can start timing our requests. And we know and we understand those. So we line those up to be in concert. And it is okay. We can go and ask for the dollars to do all of what we'll call pre-construction. We'll talk about that in terms of how we get there, because we got to figure out how big, how wide, how high, all of those items as we go along getting there. But it takes those elements. So what's the first word on top of that on the far right? What's that word up there? Patience. Now, I can tell you, again, not my first rodeo, when we start talking about development in the church, I don't know who it is in your congregation. I want you to insert the name, Sister Mary, Sister Jones, Sister whoever, who is going to follow this sentence. Y'all been talking about this for a long time. Pastor said last January, I don't see nothing. Okay? So understanding the process to understand that a pre-development cycle can take 6 months, even if you don't have to do rezoning. If you have to do rezoning, it may take 12 months. But to lay people, a project starts when a backhoe is out there turning dirt. And one of the things we're going to talk about in a little while is the process it takes to get from vision to fulfillment. And what does it take to do there? And that's why, hence the name, hold that up for a minute. That's why the name of my book is Vision to Fulfillment, because we got to make that leap from there. The next item, church survey, plan of action. I hate to say this, but the reality is that I can count on one hand the number of churches in all my years that I've been able to walk in and they hand me a plan document that says, this is what we want to do. Wallingford was one of the first. They handed me a document that said, we want to serve veterans. We have surveyed our congregation and this is what we want to do. So number one is asking yourself, what is it that we want to do? Who is it we want to serve? And figuring out how do we do that with the assets that we have? Having said that, now, here's where I come to pour water on things. Don't know how to fund a skating rink and certain other community service activities unless I find another asset to then pay the lease to support that operation. On the other side, I have a client right now that says they want to do a Del Webb community. What does that mean when they say that? Who are they trying to serve? A Del Webb neighborhood. That means they're trying to serve a high-end elderly housing. They want to do elderly housing, but they want to do high-end elderly housing. And I have to figure out a very diplomatic way to remind them that 8 years ago, this location was in what we would colloquially call the hood. It is not the hood now, but it is also does not have a fresh market. The things that those folks who are going to want for that are want to be near. So unless you want to wait another 15 to 18 years to continue that progression, then we need to tweak our approach as a part of that. So again, I come back, you will always hear me start off with what does the market yield and demand? Because one of my governmental allies made a reference to a nonprofit that built a house and they couldn't sell it in 6 months. And I started asking questions about what was the size, what was the cost. By the time they got through with size and cost, I knew why the house was sitting there, because you missed the market. That's why I started off with that picture. I said, I built this basically the same house in 3 or 4 different jurisdictions because I know that if it hits the ground, it's going to move. And there is a corollary here for us. Okay. Another piece of thinking differently. Again, I want to adjust the way that we look at the world. We all want the latest and the greatest of a new sanctuary, new community facility, what have you. But how can we get there to the same result and outcome and maybe have a different perspective? Plymouth Church approached me about potentially selling their church, which again, this is heavy on Charleston, but I do have some upstate examples. And they wanted to sell it for $3 million. I was like, I'm not even going to have a conversation because we can't sell it for $3 million. We ended up selling it for $1.7 million. But their goal was we want to move out into the suburbs and build a new church. And I showed them the example here of Grace Chapel saying that's 8,000 square feet, $1.2 million for a new church. But there was a church that happened to have been foreclosed on that we could buy for less than $500,000, put a new HVAC, new roof, new carpet, new paint, and walk into effectively, economically, a brand new church. And I'm here to tell you, I hope and pray they still have it, but they walked away with $1 million in the bank. Because they sold the church for 1.7, they invested roughly $700,000, as opposed to going and putting that back where you are now having to put all your money into another church or borrow, incur debt. So we start with a conversation on what are our goals and are there other ways to get there? Are there other mechanisms of how we can get there? So I say that as a way to look at how is it that we can take advantage of whatever's happening in the market and be realistic, create operating reserves. All too often, operating reserves is not a conversation that I'm hearing in the African American church. Operating reserves is a fancy day for rainy day money. Now, one of the items that when this became realistic, actually at the time when I was working on this church in Beaufort, I forget the name of the storm, but a storm blew through. And this is another nugget. This is an operational issue, and I hope that you all do some self-reflection after today. But whatever storm it was that blew through, I do not remember the name, caused damage across a number of churches. And a number of the churches had made the business decision that in order to keep their insurance payments reasonable, they pushed their deductibles high. And churches like Grace ended up where the damage was just barely over the deductible because they took a large deductible, but it was more than what they had in reserves. So if you are going to have in your church budget a $7,000 deductible, we doggone near make sure we have a $7,000 reserve account, whatever that math is. I'm just making up numbers. because that's where so many of those churches got into trouble, was they pushed their deductible up to get their monthly payment down. And then when the storm hit, they did not have the cash to cover that large deductible. So that is a business nugget, non-related to development, but it impacts what happens. But on to this. What is the importance of why this is relevant to our conversation today? One of the items that, again, coming back to our conversations with, I'm gonna say our elderly leadership, maybe. Who are our current banking relationships with? And understand that lenders, and I use my kids a lot for examples just to make stuff real plain. My oldest loves macaroni and cheese. My middle child, oh, now here's a Chick-fil-A fan over here, used to love ribs. I think that's starting to change. But just like our individual appetite, lenders have different appetites. And we have to understand that. Simply because we had a conversation with whoever, Wells Fargo, TD, Community Works, and that you receive one reaction does not mean that you're going to receive the same reaction from another institution. So when we start talking about, and even within the same institution, depending on who you're talking with, because what's going to happen is someone in leadership capacity, oh, I went down and talked to the branch manager and they're not interested in this loan. They're not interested in this project. But is that the community reinvestment officer whose job it is to put those out on the street? Is it the commercial lender who can understand taking that lease and making that loan against it? So we have to think about not only what institution we're having the conversation with, but who within the institution we have it. Now, and the reality is, again, to bring this real home, whoever your account manager is that sits and watches your deposits and your paying contact may not be the person that you need to have that conversation with. And you're going to have to find a very genteel way to go around them and find the person that you need to have the conversation with. I can't tell you privately, church-wise, otherwise, how many folks start a project before all of the money is in place. Do not let anyone in the leadership convince you all to start something that you do not have all of the capital stacked together. Capital stack, all of your money lined up. When I walked into Grace, this is what I saw right there on the left-hand side. Because they let the contractor talk them into, oh yeah, I'm going to go ahead and get started. And okay. We cannot start our projects until we have everything in place. And I'm just going to, a couple seconds there, but just give you a little bit. I always like to refer to this, I did not check my volume. I'll just have to speak loud. The reason that I like to focus on this particular project comes back to that conversation about patience. Is I can tell you the day that I walked in and darn near got ran out of the church. Because I talked with two lenders and looked at the financing metrics of what it would take for the loan for what they need. And out of 6 key variables, they met 3 and almost 4 of those. And I said, it's going to take you 12 months before you meet these 6 financial metrics. That was not a fun conversation. Because you're telling someone that what they want, they're going to have to wait a year in order to get. Now, if I walk in there today, I'm like a rock star. Hey, 12 months before we started construction, that was not the reception. But again, my job is to tell you what you need to hear, not what you want to hear. And so part of that piece is that we have to be able to have a conversation about budget and what we'll do. And the other item, if you see in the back, we took the approach, we basically used asphalt for 2/3 of the lot and left 1/3 as gravel as a way of meeting in the middle to be able to expedite and get things done. But that's a conversation you have on the front end before you start in construction. So it's important that we have those tough conversations, we have that and understand how we're going to get out once we get started. And we cannot allow ourselves to rush. So from an economic development perspective, Greater Middleton Chapel was a small church, even smaller than the ones we've had conversation on so far. that was a combination of 3 separate churches that came together. So they had an extra sanctuary, if you will, that they tried to lease out to small growing churches, and were trying to collect their rent, etc. And they came to me and asked, and as from a commercial leasing perspective, having a conversation with other tenants, what is the appropriate fix? Who would be the appropriate tenants that we could identify to come in and pay rent to the church? I would venture to guess that a Red Dot store might not be receiving, okay. But Alcoholics Anonymous is a part of ministry and outreach recovery. And I do not necessarily understand how their finances are structured and where they receive their donations for, but they are very well funded. They have not missed a single lease payment, signed a 10-year lease, and by being a part of the connectional church, and I did not ask how many folks represented or tied as a connectional church, but when the district assessments come, having an additional $1,700 a month coming in to just go and park into account becomes an asset. So our commercialism, when we start talking about the economic development perspective, who are other community stakeholders that can pay us lease? I mentioned earlier counseling services, like some of the shelters that might be some, Alcoholics Anonymous. Who are other agencies, our city partners, depending on where we are? Who are other agencies who can pay us lease, a lease payment that would be receptive and acceptable to the church? The other key piece here I want to touch on, and again, I want to introduce what may be, yes ma'am? Okay, yeah, I'm way off my time. But this is good. All right, so we'll take a break. But before we take this break, let me just have this conversation here. Has anyone heard the terminology, the difference between a gross lease and a net lease? No. Say? Not familiar with. Okay. Anybody have rental property? All right. If I'm renting out a 3-bedroom house, give me some numbers, just fictitious numbers. What is?
So 4-bedroom house, 3 bathrooms, $1,700.
$1,700. That is a gross lease. I'm renting out my house. I'm collecting $1,700 a month. Oh, it's cash flowing.
No, it's not.
All right. So, well, okay. And why is it not cash flowing? Because what's my property tax bill?
Mm-hmm. And my mortgage, exactly.
My mortgage, my property tax, and my insurance. Okay. A net lease means that the commercial tenant is paying a pro rata share of those operating expenses. So if I'm taking up 85% of this building, you're paying 85% of my insurance costs. You're paying 85% of my property taxes if it's on the tax roll. Now, when I talk to real estate professionals that are looking to lease space, and they don't necessarily understand common area maintenance charges and that sort of thing, it catches them by surprise. I want to pay $1,500 a month. But I'm talking to you all as landlords. We want to sign net leases, and they use this term double net, meaning they're paying 2 things or 3 things. What? How is it that we can make our economics work? And this all spelled out as a part of the core lease. So when I say that that is the rent structure of what they are receiving each month, that is their net lease. They still owe 85% of the cost to insure that property, 85% of the property taxes, because they take up 85% of the space. So in this case, Alcoholics Anonymous took up the majority of that building, and so they bear that. So that yields to the benefit of the church because it helps the church's bottom line. And that is what commercial agents normally are accustomed to and the way that they normally quote rates. But we don't know to ask for that or to put it that way. And it's not for just of exposure or whatnot. It's not, but we just have to refrain the way that we're putting our properties into the market. I think I saw a hand. Yes, sir.
To that point, if we have this on, we have the economic development side, the LLC, 501c3. At what point can we find a revenue stream to the church out of this LLC? I heard you mention a few minutes ago about this term operating reserve, where they didn't have the monies to, in their budget.
Yes.
To pay for this. Can the 501c3 or the housing component lend them the money? Is there a revenue stream for getting the money out of that?
Sure. All right. So let me, yes, short answer is yes. And I'm just trying to quickly summarize. And Tammy, I'm going to try and hit 2 quick slides and stop for this break. But
I'm trying
but
to tie all that
I got you.
together.
So when I referenced earlier about the programmatic piece, that's what I was trying to say, is that if you can go to the United Way, the city, the county, and you can provide after-school programs, if you can provide whatever that is, you tack onto that budget another 15% as administrative costs and overhead, contribution to overhead that you then can take. So if you get, instead of $50,000, it becomes $65,000. So you now have $15,000 that you can monetize back to the church as a lease payment.
Okay, gotcha.
Okay. Now, in this case, what I'm talking about is just a straight third-party lease coming into the church, just cash flow coming in this particular example. But just in case I'm not clear on that, let me say that again. When I was talking about earlier about programmatic and those things, we're taking those programs and creating those into revenue streams to pay our expenses. And maybe it's, depending on whether it's third party or not, we're charging them for utilities to go and contribute towards. And as a matter of fact, I don't want to get too far back because I want to honor this and get this break. But I will tell you, again, I come back to, we have real estate professionals in the room. We think we're saving money by not hiring a professional, but there is a church that has a commercial piece of property that they wanted to manage themselves because they thought they were saving money. And one of the tenants that they put in the project, and I'm not making this up, is a nursery. And I don't mean a nursery in terms of childcare. What I'm talking about a greenhouse. They did not pass on the water bill as a part of their lease structure. Do I need to repeat that? They lease space to a nursery. And we're proud of, oh, we don't need any help. We're receiving this. And I look at the lease and I'm like, who's paying the water bill? Recapture, a whole nother definition of recapture. So let me get through these next few tasks. Okay, now, I can't preach and teach what I don't practice. Pastor's office building, 2 units upstairs, mixed use. When I came in, we had the entire 1,700 square feet downstairs. I don't need 1,700 square feet. We signed a 10-year lease. Again, I'm coming back to who are people that are in conjunction with our ministry, with the NAACP, to occupy the largest component of that space. And so we have the 2 apartments upstairs as a mixed-use building so that we can effectively have our office free and clear as no overhead and expense. So I can't teach and preach what I'm not practicing, okay? That if I'm asking you to figure out ways to generate revenue so that you can lower your operating expenses, how do we do that? Now, having said that, I'm going to take you another step further. I love and appreciate the mission of the NAACP. But one thing you can imagine during COVID that relies on United Way, private donations, whoever making those contributions. I've now retained a commercial agent to, again, I am a commercial broker, but the lawyer who has himself as a client has a fool for a client. You may have never heard that phrase before. That I need someone else to come in and help me to find another commercial tenant because while they are paying consistent rent, they're paying below market rate rent. I'm now about to take this to a market rate transaction, which is what I want you all to do. But there were some political considerations because the vice president was my board chair. So that made some, but my point though is that we have to look at how do we leverage our assets in a different way. That's the piece. And then I'm going to end with this. Another one of those items, assisted living. There is so much market demand and need for it. And you all, if we talk about an aging population, have the ability to funnel potential clients to it. But one of the pro formas that I've looked at several years ago, and it was effectively the same, but I'm just going to use one because I know the numbers off the top of my head, was throwing off $100,000 free cash flow after hiring and paying for 25 people, after putting away reserves, rainy day money, and after operating the actual operations of itself. Now, I come back $100,000 a year, just in round numbers, call it $9,000 to $10,000 a month. I think we'll pay the secretary's salary, maybe the custodian's salary, and maybe contribute toward the pastor's salary. Am I wrong? I mean, it might just help. Okay, just a little bit. It might just help a little bit. Now, again, I say before we pass the plate, and I'm not being condescending when I talk about passing the plate. But my point, though, is that an additional source of revenue helps support, because as giving may ebb and flow, to know that we have that coming in. And I'm not saying that, I mean, we can't have our chicken dinner, but I'm just saying we don't want to depend on it.
That's right.
Yes, ma'am.
That leasing that you have come in for part of your building should be required to have their own insurance system?
Yes. We do want to check insurance and make sure that folks are properly insured as a part of, because at least a basic of liability, because if someone comes in and they get hurt, lawyers like to go up the food chain. The tenant doesn't have the money. Can I then go after the property owner? You want to make sure there's enough stopgap in between as a part of that. So, again, I've said it, no money, no mission. Again, professionally managed. Another church that I have spoken with that had the vision to go out and buy a motel actually. They had the vision to go buy a motel, but then thought that they could save the money and not hire a professional manager and manage it themselves, and ran it into the ground. Please hire professionals. We ask them, but one of the things I say is that we ask people to volunteer and serve, but they should not volunteer and serve in the things that they do that pay their light bill. If it's something they do to pay their light bill, that's not where you ask them to serve. You ask them to serve in some other capacity. So, and we already talked about location, but again, from opportunity for, and again, there are guarantee programs, which we'll talk about later in a few minutes, that can help facilitate that. But with that, I'm going to take a break because my leader says it is time for a break, and I'm sure we all need to stand, stretch, or what have you. List here of what I call pre-development or pre-construction. I use those terms interchangeably. As an industry professional, I'll say pre-development, but from a lay perspective, people understand pre-construction, all of the things that have to happen before you actually get to start to turn the dirt. And so I've got just a conceptual site plan to look at there. But first of all, starting off with what's the vision? And so that graphic represents that first bubble at the top, a higher density. Maybe that's a senior housing, maybe that's family housing, and then transitioning into duplexes, and then transitioning into single family. So part of is translating the vision of what you want to do into the real estate. And how does that interchange? So up at our main corridors, looking at how does that interact with the site and the land. And this allows me to get into one of my pet peeves, and I want to start here, and I want you all to take this. And if I step on some toes again, I'm going to say like somebody said a long time, if I hit you, it's not that I'm aiming at you, you're just in my way, okay? All right. But all too often, if we have a green site, meaning undeveloped parcel, and the church says we want to build a sanctuary, we want fellowship, we want senior housing, we want all of this. Somebody help. Where do we put the church? Now, I'm going to pretend like this is the site right here. And this is our main road. How many times I see we put the church right here? I want, when you drive down the road, I want you to see the church. I had a church to do that, and they called me up. The church was here, and they had this master plan about they were doing some senior daycare up here, and they want to do all this housing and other stuff on the campus. Got in and started looking at the work. All of this was wetland.
You said wetland?
Wetland. You stuck. You have eaten up the prime. What should have made sense from a technical standpoint is let's move the church closer to the wetland so the parking can be in your wetland area, and then you have the rest of this to develop. Now that was one specific instance, but the same thing is that if we start implementation without the holistic view of our vision and where we want to go, we end up making mistakes that limit our options. And so we don't want to have option limiting decisions. We want to start with the full range of what it is we want to talk. So we'll start off just taking a look at I call it a drive of the dirt. Conceptually, we just want to lay out and look at what can conceivably happen. And as a part of that, we'll do a number of different things. We use a term called geotech, just drilling holes in the ground based on where we think we're going to put our buildings to make sure that we have good soil. Can we really build what we want to build in those areas? Phase 1 environmentals, making sure that, somebody doesn't tell us, Pastor, this is a good property right here. We can get you in here for $250,000 and you buy this 8 acres and find out it's got environmental contamination. Because nobody's going to want to mislead the church, would they? Okay. All right. Okay. Because they think you don't know any better and you see a good deal. Because, of course, if it's priced that well, and I'm going to send out, I'm going to make sure we'll get the slides out to everybody so that you can have those. We will definitely do that. And I'll at least do it maybe like 2 a page so it's not like that big. Because for me, I'm a little sight challenged now than I used to be. So I appreciate the larger font. But again, I keep using this word feasibility and market studies and market demand because we want to make sure that what we're doing can actually work. Now, there are no guarantees, but we want to be as sure as we can about what's happening there. Depending on where we are, additional environmental site control, but at the end of the day, we want to have a business plan. When we walk into Community Works, they want to know not only what we want to do, but how the money's going to get paid back, how we're going to use it. Now, in the early days, I don't care if you're asking for $500,000 or $5 million, we ought to be able to tell our story in between a page and 2 pages, page and a half, to boil our vision down to as succinct. Okay, now we might attach a pretty picture, a site plan like this, and a budget, but at that stage, what we're going for is, does this fit your appetite? Is this something that you're interested in? We're not trying to tell the whole story. And that becomes a key piece because I'm here to tell you, you only have a few seconds. You think with a job application at a resume, you only get a few seconds on somebody's desk. On the bank's desk, you've got a few seconds to catch their attention. So we want to be succinct and to the point. And I understand, now I'm really about to step on something. I am a believer, but the lender is not trying to hear about the Lord. He's trying to hear about repayment. So we've got to translate that vision. Yes. And we believe that, but we've got to translate that in a way that they can hear the message of what we're trying to say. Okay. So that's all those pieces that are there. Now, yes, sir.
Could you talk about the market study from the perspective of the church mission when the market outside the doors of the church is a little different than the church, and what shifts are needed in the mindsets of the church when they start doing business
Amen.
outside the doors?
Thank you. So the question as it relates to the market of the church and the market outside the church in the immediate vicinity, because again, I'm not talking about anybody in this room, but in some of the other churches, the folks who show up on Sunday morning no longer live in the community. They now have moved with George Jefferson on up and are coming back to the church. So those folks who are immediately around may have a higher degree of need. And I mean, let me just give I'm going to say this in a real broad brush piece, and that doesn't disclose anything that's confidential, but my home church, when Brooklyn decided to build the Northeast campus, it was not until the Northeast campus was open and thriving and running during the realization on the budget hit that the most fluent part of the congregation was in the Northeast sanctuary. And that's not to say that the folks who were at the West Campus were poor. That's not what I'm saying. But when you start really looking at the census, the zip codes of who our people are, and which is another piece of, as you start doing your own due diligence, you have everybody's zip code. Then let's look at what the majority of those are, and then go to one of the census databases and see what are the economics of those neighborhoods, because that might give you the clue of here's where we need to do our outreach in terms of physical development. But then how do we then serve those who are immediately around us? And that is where we may say those are the targets that we are reaching out to our municipal partners, our governmental partners, to help us facilitate that, because those may or may not cash flow. I don't want to try and assume that every church is in an area that the incomes may not necessarily support, but we have to take that into consideration as a part of that. That has to be a consideration. That's why I made a reference to the fact earlier that, you know, of someone having a desire of doing high-end senior housing, but they couldn't do it where they physically are. And maybe that is the appropriate place for a low-income housing tax credit elderly project, so we can serve and house in a way that meets the economic demographics of who it is that's immediately around us. And then as Wallingford found out when they built those units, wow, then randomly some of those residents come to church on Sunday morning. Wow, we didn't count on that, but okay, that's another blessing. We accept that and we're thankful for that. So yes, I think that is a key piece. So when we start talking about, when we meet internally, is there a disconnect, or is our membership in sync with those surrounding us and where our property is? And do we need to align a couple different outcomes as relates to those?
To that point, I think within 5 miles to the church, I think I passed, about 10, 15 churches before I get to it.
Yes, yes. So that touches on something else that I do want to touch on for a brief moment. We tend to duplicate a lot of services. And so are we willing to work together? And I'm going to tell a true story. In today's climate, it's hard to imagine, but 15 years ago, there was a time that Lindsey Graham and Clyburn jointly held outreach sessions to bring in HUD, USDA, et cetera. Now, that may not happen in today's world, but that was, and in one of those sessions, Jesse Risher, who at that time was over community facilities, was having a conversation. I walked up and he said, oh, here's the guy you need to talk to. You need to talk to FA. He can help you. And another pastor walked up and said, this is what I want to do in the community. He said, well, the gentleman that just left had the same idea. You two should partner. You're in the same community. Why don't y'all partner? Oh, well, they spun off from us, our church, and they're independent now. And so you're making it difficult by not working together when the visions are similar or the same. So that's why I asked the question, how do we divide this pie up? Maybe one piece of it, one church operates, and one another, if we are able to figure out ways of how we can collaborate. And I understand that collaboration may or may not necessarily happen, but I do think that that is a realistic piece. One item I do want to touch on before I leave pre-development, pre-construction, and I did not put the slide in, but when I was doing some work for Brooklyn some years ago, when they acquired the school site, we took a look as a part of this pre-development piece, and on two sides of the building was a 6-inch water line. The third side of the building had a 2-inch water line. Had we not spent the money on the pre-development piece, we would not have known that when we were looking at doing an assisted living facility potentially, and the market study was showing a tremendous demand for that. I asked myself how the residents on that side of the school building got water pressure off of that 2-inch water line, and then if we had put another 80 units without realizing that, we would have been in bad shape because we would have had to go back and rip that road up and do all of that. So this front end money to do these assessments sometimes seems like, why are we spending this money? But when you don't know certain facts, it just is belt and suspenders to make sure that we have the information that we need to make an informed decision. Because if we go to a community works and say we need $2 million to do this project, and oops, now we need to put in a 4-inch water line that's twice the cost of our contingency in our budget, and the contingency is nothing but a word for oops money, then we've got to take those into account early on. So how does that all look? You know, the other presentation is just by list, but then by service. So somebody's got to do some cost estimates, some engineering, and again, I come back to what I said earlier. Who's higher up on my chart, the engineer or the architect?
The engineer.
Okay. And again, I'm not beating up on architects, but I'm trying to say, but all of those different issues, how do we manage those pieces, all those different pieces? And then again, maintain our accountability to the congregation. And if we are a connectional church, how do we handle our relationship back to the church conference, church body, the district, what have you? And then our lender and our community participants. So we need to take all of those different elements into account. But the mission of the Housing Community Development Department is to work on community revitalization, community development, all of those things. There are a series of items that were listed, in terms of what their responsibility. Maybe that's owner-occupied rehab, whether that's new construction, whether that's rental, all of those different elements, that is their mission. Their mission lines up with what you are potentially interested in doing. So as we look at those missions, here's the reality. If you have, is anybody in here employed? Anybody got a job? Okay. We get annual reviews, performance reviews. The same thing goes with our loan officers and our city staff folks. They want places to take pictures of. Our elected officials want to have, so they want to partner with you. But you have to translate your vision in a way that lines up with those. And so that matches those goals and objectives. So if we can line those up with their goals and objectives, then we can get access to the resources they bring to the table. So one of the things in terms of transition I want to do, and we can do it without the visual aids, but is start talking about affordability. And now I don't, Tammy, I may have to, because I had the numbers for Greenville, and I can't do it off the top of my head, but I had the 100% AMI numbers, the 80% AMI numbers, but I'm going to use Charleston because I can do it off the top of my head. If we were selling a house at $270,000, someone at 80% of area median income for a family of 4 is going to need roughly $80,000 to buy that house down to $190,000 that they would qualify for. Somebody at 120% of median income would only need $10,000 to buy that down from $270,000 to $260,000. So when we start talking about area median income and who's being served and that sort of thing, the correlation of that then starts talking about what is their buying power and what does that mean. So if it's costing us to do it correctly, $270,000 to deliver a house on the ground, we can then back into how much subsidy we need to achieve that. Now, the other part of that might also, the corollary to that might mean that if the market is a $280,000 market or a $290,000 market, does that then translate to an opportunity? We just do it all at market rate and take that money and reinvest that money into the programs of the church. If the market will support 200, now of course you get the folks, who can afford that? Ain't nobody afford that. That's not who we're trying to serve right now. Or we'll take 10% of the units and we'll use for that, or 20% or whatever. That's the policy decision of what we're trying to do to achieve our goals and objectives. Okay? So we start translating those numbers. Well, actually, I'm sorry, I was calling time, but we have real estate, 2 left. We still have 2 in the room. Family of 4, 100% of median income. How much house can they purchase between Greenville and Anderson County?
I'm sorry, you said $400,000?
I said a family of 4. Family of 4. What's the median price point that they can afford? At 100% of median income. 320. 320. Okay. One thing I'll say, Greenville, like Charleston, is a strong demand market, so you have the ability of that push to push those numbers up.
Market right now too. So, pre-pandemic, prices have been inflated by about $30,000.
Not only, she said, prices have been inflated by about $30,000. Not only that, interest rates are extremely low. So we have to position ourselves that what we're doing will work, not if, but when the market shifts. So we can't necessarily try and extract out every dollar out of that. So typically when we start talking about affordable housing, from a HUD standpoint, a county standpoint, they're saying that we want to make sure that someone is not house burdened, that they're not spending more than 30% of their household income, of their income on household expenses. Now, depending on the metrics, some people say 35 and include transportation. But in these days, where gas prices are, you add that in the metric, then you might have a different problem on those affordability spectrum. And then you hear this term workforce housing, because the reality is, you hear that term, the working poor, I make too much to qualify for a subsidy, but I can't necessarily qualify for what's happening in the market. So what is happening with our firefighters, our teachers, our folks who are making what might be considered an entry-level wage or what have you? How do we achieve that? So you hear this term. Now, there is a different perspective now as more people move into the affordable housing metric, and when they are not referring to people of brown and African American descent, they start using terminology of attainable housing. It's the same thing, but it's a different approach and a different mindset and a different way of tacking into it, and how we're trying to do it is that it broadens the spectrum. Because most of the time we start talking about attainable housing, we're now moving from 80% to 120% of the area median income. And statistically speaking, if we're talking about brown and black communities, and we look at that spread between 80 and 120, our representation in that group is going to begin to diminish. So when we start using that terminology, asking about who is it we're actually trying to serve, are we trying to serve our service workers? Who is it that we're trying to achieve and to serve? So that becomes a very critical piece of trying to figure out those pieces of the puzzle. So we use that term, and I started off with talking about affordability and that sort of thing, but I want to just take a few minutes and talk about that, because when it comes to our governmental folks, they're looking to serve a specific demographic. And then the other thing you want to know is how long do these strings stay in place? As governments put more and more money into projects, they lengthen the affordability period out. Charleston County, if you put in more than $15,000, your compliance period is 10 years. If you put in more than $15,000, you then move into a 20-year compliance period. So that those, and to be honest, I'm gonna tell you, the office building that I showed you all, I was responding to an appraiser this past week, and he asked about the compliance period, and I looked to see that the office building compliance period rolls in 2023. Yes. And I just realized that, yes, I can push the rent structure up on those in a very short period of time. But those units have been in place for a long period of time as well. So that's one of the things that we have to ask is how long is that and what have you. Because what that means, though, for the church, though, is assuming for a minute we're talking about rental property, that at the end of that compliance period, if it's 10 years, 15 years, you have to ask your local reps, how long is Spartanburg? Anything over $15,000 is 20 years. But now the church now may say, okay, well, that's fine, but then the long ball, can we maintain it during that 20-year period, to which point in time then we may be able to push the rent structure up. And again, but it's who is it we're targeting? So those become the key pieces of that. Okay. Yes, sir. So we're dead?
You need someone like you that's familiar with different programs. There are some programs that can help that being used, be able to afford.
Amen.
There are some programs, and they are limited, but can give you a down payment assistance. There are some programs out there that are available to help workforce, that will help firefighters, help police officers, or whatever, with some subsidies. Being able to access those different subsidies can often help, and although they are limited in scope, there are some programs out there.
That's correct. So whether it's Federal Home Loan Bank, I think the way theirs are structured, if they offer, I'm doing it off the top of my head, so somebody's going to tell me my number is off, but if in general we can apply for $7,000, if you fall in those categories, I think it bumps from $7,000 to $10,000. Am I pretty close? Okay, I'm slightly. All right. So yes, there are others. Yes, the state, you can go to state. But the other thing too is, if the church has a separate 501c3 and you're trying to help serve your constituents, why not apply to the county and get your own DPA money? Let's go ask for $30,000 in down. Am I wrong? Okay. So you tell your congregation, if y'all want to buy a house, we're going to have our own pot of money to help you. Okay. Now, those are eligible. So yes, there are limited sources otherwise, but then now, of course, you got to set up selection criteria and how you're going to show it. But obviously, if you know that contract's coming and it's going to come in July, then you start telling your folks to get your stuff together and be ready to apply so that you line those up. But you can go and do that and create your own programs. So we can create some of our own programs of how we can help our constituents get into those houses to do that. Now, the key piece, though, is when they have their public information sessions about programs, listen to what they say their priorities are and then how you can then characterize what you want to achieve in line with that programmatic goal. We typically might say we want to do a food pantry, we want to do a social service, we want to do something else. But if they say that their priority is funding infrastructure or housing or what have you, can we align that up? And keep in mind, I'm going to use housing as an example, but infrastructure, if they only have money for infrastructure and we want to build housing, then just say, okay, our budget for water and sewer is $10,000 a house, and that's how we're coming up with our $100,000 we're asking for. So you can turn that and say, I'm not asking for it for construction, I'm asking for it for infrastructure. And if there are programmatic pieces, then how do we characterize and do that? And so those are just, tools and resources from there. This is the next phase that I want to try and briefly touch base on. But we talked about those goals. These are your city and county government, and I'll email these out so that you all can get those. But those are our goals and objectives from the city standpoint. And then what I did was, which I gave it verbally to you, and I'll send this to you. This translates, on the far left is area median income, and it shows what the mortgages that they can qualify for, and a sales price, and then the amount of subsidy in that sort of greenish, bluish color of how much subsidy it takes to buy that house down. That's the type of analysis that we have to do when we're taking on a home ownership project, but it's the same type of process we have to do if we're looking at a rental project. Is how much can somebody afford, and how much is our debt service going to be, and we figure out how much subsidy do we need to make it happen. Okay. Now, I skipped over this, but this gets back to the point I made earlier about reaching out to who's outside the walls and who we're serving, and also can we follow a market rate. I didn't go into it, but I had one of my own personal projects that was not faith-based, but doing what some folks will call a McMansion in downtown Columbia. And when I rolled out and said that the sales price was going to start at $450.5 million, and there were some who said, that's not affordable. And I asked the question back, because I'm colored, did you think I was necessarily doing something that was affordable? I was following the market. Okay? So there are some times in certain circumstances where we may have to look at how we're going to follow the market. Okay? All right, so I'll get that to you. So here's Greenville. So Greenville, family of four, 100% AMI, $74,000, $74,900. 80% area income, $57,000. So I'm going to speculate that 80% is probably going to translate, I don't want to do this off the top of my head, but somewhere around 170 buying power. Does that sound right to some of my real estate folks? $170,000 in buying power for somebody at 57,000? It's close. It's close. It's not exact, but it's close enough. So at the end of the day, I will present to you that whether you are doing a single family house, and that's, by the way, the first house I ever built, or if you're doing some type of mixed use project or a retail project, the same question is, how is it going to happen? Who's going to control it? And so from a vision standpoint, I ask you, are you going to control what's happening around you? Or is the community going to continue to change and you don't participate in the economics of what's happening around you? So that's where we start to transform from education to implementation, and where it starts to come back to for you all. Yes?
To maintain that, you may say that integrity of that neighborhood, whatever that means, is it feasible for people, seniors, my age, or
Okay.
properties that may be marginal in market cost to, I won't use the term donate, but sell at a
I'm good. Thank you.
reduced price to the, I think, church, whereby they can maintain it to make certain that it's secure. I see that as an opportunity as well.
Yes, so part of,
That property is kept in the family, so to speak.
Part of the giving program may be contribution of property and assets from members to contribute those that may not have extended family, to contribute those to the church. And that is a part of how we might build our assets and our inventory. And but we need to start planting that seed. Is maybe that's part of our estate planning piece, is keep your church in mind as a part of those, whether they're in good repair, bad repair, what have you, because at the end of the day, God ain't making no more land. And the market will change and turn at some point. So with that, let me try and touch base. And again, I'll provide these, but let me just plant some seeds. Internal conversation, meaning within your individual church bodies, is talking about this assessment, organizational assessment. A stakeholder is anyone that can help you or hurt you. So from a nugget perspective, individually and collectively, let's just start making a list of who are the stakeholders. Community Works might be over here on the positive. Maybe it's a competing church might be over here on the negative. Or can we move that to a positive? What can help us or hurt us? Our city and county folks. Having those internal conversations about that. What's in our way? Maybe it is what's immediately around the church. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But barriers, identification, all those things. Our own assessment of our own strengths and weaknesses. Maybe it is that we have a declining congregation in terms of age. But doing this internal assessment of asking those questions of what are the things that are required in order for us to put this action plan together. That's an internal conversation. So when you get these slides, look at that and have that internal conversation. And I suspect you're going to have some conflict in terms of the outcomes of how we perceive and look at that. So let me start with a few definitions as we start moving forward. But we've talked about it. You saw the graphic about due diligence piece, but starting with the mission, defining what is it that we want to do, looking at the feasibility components of it, and then our financial plan. But at the end of the day, it's got to be managed. Long-term facility management. It's one thing to have the idea, we get it implemented, but how do we manage it long-term? That's both the professional management, but also, our perception and role within the community, all of those different elements. How do we juggle those? So those start to form our point of beginning. Now, it's going to seem like I did this a little bit out of order, but I wanted to show you the range first of the range of some possibilities of potential projects. And I've stayed away from our larger multifamily just to kind of start with some incremental piece, our assisted living for the most part. But at the end of the day, there's a lot of different terminology. The church is a nonprofit entity, but when we talk about having a separate 501c3 as being a tool and a resource, I don't want everybody to run out. We need to go get a 501c3. That's why Pastors is here. There's some other nonprofits you can partner with. I mean, I've even, on some of the financing on some of these, I've even done some joint ventures, if you will, with some other nonprofits that were looking for a return and wanted to get the credit for the units. So you don't have to necessarily start, but it is a tool and a resource. But if you want to go ask for certain people for money, you're either going to need to team up with somebody or have your own. That's there. But at the end of the day, please also keep in mind, a 501c3 is a tax status. Why do I emphasize it is only a tax status? Because we need to think and operate that at the end of each year, our revenues exceeded our expenses. Simply because we are doing mission and we are doing outreach, our financial budgets must make sense. So we are running a business. The church is a business. Now, I say I'm a little bit odd because when I was a child, I did not learn Jesus wept. Then you started learning Bible verses. My father started with Ecclesiastes 10:19. Feast is made for laughter and wine maketh merry, but money answereth all things. Hence is why our clergy start off with bring all the tithes into the storehouse, because it's not that we are chasing the money, but whatever it is that is important that we want to achieve, the money is what holds it up and makes it feasible for us to achieve that and carry out. Okay? So from that standpoint, we have to make sure that we are, people say, oh, I'm running a nonprofit. You're running a business. Otherwise, you will soon be out of business. So we have to think about it from that standpoint. From that, once we leave there, then we start a whole bunch of other terminology. CDCs, Community Development Corporations, CHODOs, Community Housing Development Organizations, which again is just another specific structure that says we're not letting the government control us too much, and we're accountable to our community, and it has specific requirements as it relates to our bylaws and that sort of thing. And then the different pieces of business development organizations like a CHODO, and our different funding sources, CDBG, Community Development Block Grant, Home Investment Partnership, and then HOPWA. Let me tell you something. HOPWA stands for Housing Opportunities for People with AIDS. Now, historically, there have been some reluctance with some of the African American churches about utilizing HOPWA funds, but somebody tell me if I'm wrong from the government standpoint. HOPWA funding has not gone down. HOPWA funding has continually increased, and there are only a certain number of providers that are accessing that money. So here is a question for you, and here's a real live situation right now. Another one of our Reformed Episcopal churches that is looking to do a rehab of 2 units. I went to Roper St. Francis Hospital, and I said, I know because I've spoken to the Community Development Director, there's $126,000 of unspent money sitting there that I can't touch, but you can. You go apply for that money, and I'll put it in my project, and I'll sign a long-term lease to only serve your clients. That's called a guaranteed stream of income. The hospital, so we have to look at how we structure those. But that is a source where a funding source that is continuing to increase, but the number of people who are pursuing it is not. CDBG is the most fought after pot of money that there is. They're always going to be oversubscribed. Am I wrong? Okay. But the beautiful thing about the church is it might be easier for you to achieve the CHODO status because you can find some representatives that either live in low-income area or that can meet those criteria required to do that. But it also means that they have a 15% set aside that they have to spend with CHODOs. So what am I saying? I'm saying chase the money. That's what I'm saying. And I'm not saying you go put your programs just because there's money for this, you go do it. But let's be strategic and make sure that if what our mission is, that there's money that lines up with it. Think about how we do that. But I'm trying to point out underused assets that can do that. I've already talked about market rate for deferred forgivable. Let me touch on that real quickly. Most of the debt that Pastors has on its balance sheet is deferred forgivable debt. I've got probably $2 million of deferred forgivable debt on balance, which means I'm not paying any interest payments, but like I referenced the office building having a compliance period that ends in 2023, until that comes, that debt has to be recognized on the balance sheet, at which point it is then forgiven. Oftentimes, that is a way of how we can structure our public money is we are borrowing it, but we're not having to pay it back as long as we serve the people who we say we're going to serve. Now, I said earlier about making sure who we have on our boards and service and not making sure that we don't have somebody that's just takes the reins and run and do what they want to do. You say you're going to serve 65% area median income, and 5 years in, you put in somebody that makes, you would say, this isn't paying enough rent, we want to double the rent and put in somebody that makes $100,000 a year, recapture. The county's going to come knocking and want their money back. So we have to do what we say we're going to do. One of my hot button issues, especially in the faith community, but in general, is price versus cost. I will submit to you, please nugget, write this down. Price and cost are not the same. But we ask all the time, how much is this going to cost? Somebody asks me, what do I charge? What is my hourly rate? Now, typically, we will look at what the scope of what needs to be done and figure out what's the professional, all those professional fees, and we create a budget that we go to either the bank or the funding source, whoever will come to do it. I promise you, I don't care if you're talking about construction, architectural engineering, if you are making a decision based on price, you will pay the cost. Let me say that again. If you make your decision based on the price tag, you likely will pay the cost in the long run. I have one specific example I use, for example, contractor I want to put in a water line to serve 6 units. He came in $12,000 cheaper than the next two highest bidders. What should have been a 60-day process turned into almost a 6-month process. He popped the city's main water line. I would gladly have paid the additional money for someone to come in, do it right, fast, and okay? But that is an argument that you're going to have in-house, because I can't tell you the number of times, oh, I got Pookie and Ray Ray that can do it for less. Do it for cheaper, okay? All right. But my point, though, is that's one of my pet peeves when we start talking about price and cost. Those are the things that we have to think about. But those definitions, when you get those slides, look at those points, because those are the things that we have to make sure that we're comfortable with as a part of our vision setting. Tammy, don't worry, we're good, we're okay. So we talked about setting your vision, issues to consider. Bottom on page 2, understanding local market forces. The value of a public-private partnership. We cannot do this alone. Just like they got me up here while I'm talking to get me back. That public-private partnership. We need our public folks. We need private collaboration. It is a joint effort. We cannot make this walk alone. I've covered, but the one thing I did not touch on the middle of page 3 when I talked about the elements of pre-development, look at this. 60 to 90 days for planning, 60 to 90 days for architectural drawings and cost estimates, 60 days for permitting, and let me tell you something. If you're in Beaufort or Charleston, that 60 days is going to be twice that. I haven't permitted anything in Greenville in about 2 years. Greenville was not that bad. 69 days for marketing strategy. So we start adding all of that up, understanding and managing our expectations that from the time we go from the idea that we're moving forward to the time that we get to construction, we're talking about 6 months to a year potentially before someone who does not have sight can see the fruit of our labor, before that is translated on the ground. That is all pre-construction.
Can I ask a question at this point? How about this 501(c)(3)? Is that a board of governors? Who legislates this? Is there an oversight committee or anything to see that these things are carried out that you're mentioning here?
So your nonprofit's governing documents, your bylaws will set forth how you operate and how you're governed internally. Now, the state sets forth general rules in terms of how a corporation must function and provides for reporting requirements to the Secretary of State. And if you do not turn in financial reports after 6 months after they're due, then they hit you with a daily fee up to $2,000 and some dollars if you do not comply. But that is part of running the businesses of reporting and accountability. Now, if there is malfeasance, then we're now talking about law enforcement, if you will, for simple purpose. But that is in the event of malfeasance.
See that happens, the institution needs an oversight committee to see that that's done on time.
That is good governance, that we make sure that we have the right people serving on those boards that are doing and are aware of what we need to do. And now the IRS now has made it real simple. If you do not file your 990 for 3 consecutive years, you will automatically be revoked. So you don't have to worry about it. It will happen on year 3. When you miss that 3rd filing date, you will be automatically revoked. So these elements, what we're talking about doing to a commercial lender.
I think he's asking though, if you have to have a board of directors, and you do in order to be a 501c3.
Yeah, that's included.
Yeah, it's required.
Yes, and I apologize, I missed that part of the question. I didn't understand that. Thank you for that clarity. And as a part of that board, I am suggesting that you don't want to make it a completely identical board to your governing church board. You want them to have a little bit of a difference between the two. That's not, you may say that 3 of the board members are the president, the vice president, or whatever of the trustees or the deacons or whatever that governing body is, but that there's some differential between those so they're not exactly the same. Because if they're exactly the same and somebody wants to come and sue this entity, it makes it easier to sue over here because it looks as if you were just trying to create a show. So you want to create that appearance of a difference and distinction. So I thank you for that clarity. I apologize.
So there should be some overlap.
Yes, you want to make sure you have some overlap to make sure you have control. And at least make sure what you do not want to do if you are transferring church property is to make that a completely self-perpetuating board. That gets to the point that somebody asked me earlier about people taking over your organization. You want to make sure that it is accountable back to it. And there are ways, for example, you say in the bylaws that if the organization dissolved, that the assets go back to what have you. Yes, thank you. So how do we make this fit to where our commercial lenders, I said earlier that Community Works understands this type of project, but some of our commercial lenders may not. So how do we make what may seem unfundable, fundable? And so I use the word enhancement. That's in the middle of the page on top of page 4. Strengthen collateral, providing guarantees. Reducing expenses, maybe that's getting grants and equity, getting some technical assistance, partnering with someone that has a track record, or other ways to increase our revenue. And I'm going to give you a good example. Again, when I'm talking with, I'm just live conversation. For one of my clients, we went to LISC, local, no, I'm not trying to call it, Local Initiatives Corporation, I forget the exact name, to borrow $3.5 million to buy some apartments. I got there because I was on the phone with TD Bank asking them to give me a bridge loan. Their CRA officer, their community reinvestment officer, and their commercial lender for the region were on the call. And I'm articulating what we're going to do, and the commercial lender's asking me a gazillion questions. Well, how is this going to work? How do you? And the CRA officer with me on the line shut him down. He is correct. Let him finish, and we'll go through this. Because the commercial lender does not understand this realm of what Community Works sees on a regular basis and what the Community Reinvestment Act sees on a regular basis. And the loan that I was seeking, TD's cap for that was $1 million, so he then referred me over to LISC to borrow the 3.5 because it exceeded what they could do. But my point, though, is that simply because you're talking to a representative of the bank and they say that we can't do that, knowing that you're talking to the right person at the bank becomes important. And making sure they understand that mission. So you ask them, what other affordable housing, economic development activities have you done? Because then the rest of the page 4 starts laying out all the things that have to be in our financing package, our business plan that tells our story. This is how we're telling our story. This is the long version. I told you, I said, you ought to be able to tell your story in a page and a half. This is the long story. This is where you tell how Pastor done felt the vision since he was 12 years old, all the way through to today. And I'm not being glib. I'm trying to make the point that, but y'all have read some church histories. We start from emancipation and bring that church history all the way forward. But how are we going to fund that? So we talked about how we address all those, market absorption, how are they going to get those money? Development budget, operating pro forma, how the cash flows are going to work, all of those things. Development team resumes, if we need a guarantor. Now, let me talk about this. The nonprofit can borrow without having to have personal guarantees. It has a corporate guarantee. But this can become a sticky situation when it comes to our seniors. I'm not going to call the church name, but the church secretary was assigned to be the signer for the church when we went to go do a veterans housing project, and she got to closing and freaked out because she did not distinguish between signing on behalf as the secretary for the church versus signing for herself personally. So we have to look at the signature blocks and make sure that we're signing as our representative in our capacity as the deacon, trustee, treasurer, whatever of the church, not that we're signing individually and you're not personally guaranteeing this. This is, so when we talk about the guarantees, maybe it's the company's guarantee, the nonprofit's guarantee, or the church's guarantee, and having that. And that is an education process to make sure that we understand that. Because I had to, without exaggeration, go back, call for another church conference, and elect another officer to come and sign all of the documents at closing. Because they, in part of me, did not listen to me to begin with, and I said, I'll specifically list only one person, the pastor, and any other officer or trustee, so I could not just call Brother Johnson and come sign the rest of these documents. But no, we want the secretary to go do that. No. I mean, if it's happened, I believe it's like that farmer's commercial. I've seen it. Okay? I know a thing or two because I've seen a thing or two. Okay? And then in the middle of page 5, we start talking about the different types of risk. There's construction risk, which I've already talked about. In the last 18 months, construction prices have gone through the roof. Interest rate risk. We are in a short window of time. Now is not the time to sit and wait. Interest rates will start to move up. And separate from interest rates right now, a lot of municipalities and counties are trying to unload this Rescue Act money. Now is the time to make these requests. And then also understanding what is the time cycle for the normal and ordinary customary times of request. Economic risk, the things that lenders have no control over. And then there's a whole bunch of definitions about loan to cost, loan to value, equity, which at the appropriate time we can get into much more detailed conversation. But basically, we want to understand what's the relationship between what we're proposing and how that debt service is going to be paid and what our overall debt is from that standpoint. Do we want to bond the contractor or not? Those are all different elements and thought processes that we need to take into consideration. So take your time and read and digest this. This is a very key piece to understand where we're going, how we're going, and how we're going to get there. But I think when we start looking at things, let's come back and talk about our vision, okay? I just want to end with this and make sure we have at least a few minutes for questions. But this is a point of departure. And I said there between a stimulus and response, there's our response. And how do we respond, and how do we take advantage of doing it? But here's the question I want to ask you. For all the work that has been done, prayer walks, citizens advisory committees, whatever else outwards, how much do we own? How much do we control? And how much of our assets are producing a return back to us? That is that an economic development directive that our host opened us up with, is to ask. We're really talking about legacy building. When we ask the question about what are we doing for our children's children, today is the day that we are planting the seeds that hopefully someone else will come to harvest later on. But we have to take that action and move forward and do it. But I come back to what I said earlier. Before we can talk about transforming the community, we must transform our minds and how we act and how we respond. So you then become the stewards that have to leave here and carry that message back to your colleagues in the church. We have a lot of talent. But one of the things that my father ingrained in my head was the concept of co-opetition. We have to cooperate together in order to compete. We, in general, human nature, but particularly people of color, have been taught, or programmed, I should say, that life is a zero-sum game. Zero-sum means all or nothing. I get it, you don't get it. But I heard decades ago, Reverend Juanita Weems preach a sermon, and she talked about the difference between competition and pacing each other towards excellence. Pacing each other towards excellence means I want you to succeed, and I want to succeed. I want to get there, and I want you to get there, that we get there together. And we must look at it that way as we look at how we're going to move forward and push this thing forward. Think about, I am a Frankie Beverly and Mays fan. I love music. It's great to have the voice out front, Pastor. But somebody had to write that music for him, right? Somebody got to write that grant. Somebody had to play those instruments. Somebody's got to be the quarterback on the field to manage these projects. Collectively, we work together and we achieve the goal. It takes that team effort to get there. So when we start thinking about that, I reflect back to the conversation I had earlier about capital. Financial capital is one aspect. There's human capital, there's social capital. You all leverage those. And when it comes to one of the bullets that I barely touched on, and we talked about what's the role of the faith-based community, that last bullet talked about advocacy, changing local and state legislation. If you all show up and you ask collectively to your council members, how are these affordable dollars being spent in brown and black communities and being leveraged, and you're doing that individually, you can still carry out your own individual projects, but making sure that the budgets are put in place to provide those resources and subsidies as a part of that. And then I can back to the whole leadership perspective. Looking at our leadership, I want to just get you to think about things a little bit differently. Some of you say that what I've said resonates with you. But when you start talking about people who, some of your colleagues that may not resonate quite the same, or some of you who may be sitting on the fence, I ask you to think about a few things. Do any of y'all remember Eastman Kodak? The head of Kodak did not believe that digital photography would change the world. The reason you remember the name, you don't see it every day, is because they did not believe that the world would change and leave them behind. Okay? I remember Circuit City. Best Buy pivoted, and they're still here and thriving. Even in the pandemic, how they pivoted, and you go into their offices now, their stores now, and look at the difference of how they carry, what they carry in the store versus online. I would not, as a child, have thought that I would not see Eastern Airlines, TWA. Maybe y'all too young to remember those names. Okay? But when we start talking about sustainability, Blockbuster, Netflix has completely changed the world. Okay? So, Toys R Us, bankrupt. Okay, gone. So when we think about that and we talk about our dying, some of our congregations that are beginning to, how do we pivot and change our methodology and how we're doing it? Okay. My high school's motto was the courage to strive for excellence. We have to have that courage to step out there because I say again, inaction isn't decision. Inaction is an action. If we fail to act, we are making a decision. So we must think about that, how we can do that. I've given you a number of different examples, and we go back and look at those, and you start reflecting on those. But all of those are how we are going to get there. So we can start with the vision and have the courage to take that. We can experience the leadership, but we have to have the tenacity to make it plain, implement it, and move it forward. So this, I say, is your call to action. You ask yourself, where do we want to be as a congregation in 1 year, 3 years, and 5 years? That's a question that you have to ask yourself. That is your response. At that point, it's on you in terms of how we move forward and work from there. Thank you for your time. I appreciate the questions, and I welcome any other questions for me. Yes, ma'am.
Your information.
Thank you. Question?
When y'all get us together in our church for a workshop, will you be available? I'm serious.
It depends. Is Charles going to be there?
Yes.
I'll think about it. My cell phone, can't be more direct than that. I'm coming. Yes, I am, and I'm gonna follow back. Yes, I'm here as a resource. Pastors is here as a resource. I think as the surveys were helpful to kind of get a gauge for what you all seek to do and what they're going. And it may be helpful to do some clustering, if there's willing, that those who are at the point that want to move to the next level, that we can have a deeper dive conversation on the financing aspect, and then maybe some that may be not quite there, that may want to have a deeper dive conversation on the visioning aspect, and we can certainly do that. And we are here as a resource, call it technical assistance, to try to assist and move that vision along, and we'll certainly reach out. And whether that's by email or cell phone, my cell I will give, because I did promise some of you, I am bad about carrying cards, but it's 803.
You got his number, Charles?
He said 803?
665 5562, 803-665 5562. And you can reach me a couple different ways. pastorsinc@gmail.com, just pastorsinc@gmail.com. And my development group is a whole lot longer, so if you want to use that, but that's a lot shorter to write than F.A. Johnson at fajohnsondevelopmentgroup.com. But Pastors Inc. will work. And I'm happy to be here. Sir? It doesn't matter. The casing doesn't matter. fajohnsondevelopmentgroup.com.
Let's give F.A. Johnson another round of applause, please, for all of the great information that he has shared today. You have one more question?
A statement.
Okay.
F.A. And this is things collaboratively and trying to do things differently and being able to help each other. Okay. All the churches represented here on Monday morning go make a deposit in somebody's bank
Amen.
from the collection. Okay, and they have a pretty good relationship with that bank. The city of Greenville collects taxes from everybody that has a business in the city. But all of those businesses, the city makes them bid on which one of those banks they are going to use to place those taxes in once they collect them. We place our money in different banks and have no leverage with those banks. What if we made the banks bid on the money that we put in their banks and collectively bank? Would that give us some leverage with them? Or would it be more feasible for us to think about forming a credit union and putting our money in our own? Just some food for thought.
Yes, sir. I appreciate, Mr. Brother Gardner, your feedback, and it is always good to see old friends across the board and so many new faces as well. I appreciate the time to be with you. I do think that thinking about our relationship with our depository institutions is a very critical piece. I have seen people try to do that, and unfortunately, some of the desires to collaborate don't necessarily manifest because there's a lot of, if I speak freely, egos about who gets credit for this, that, and the other, and some of those downset pieces as a part of that. So that's not to say you can't, somebody may not want to try that again, but I do say this. I ask the question, if you are pursuing a project and the financial institution where your deposits are does not have a desire to look at those projects, then we do need to do some self-reflection in terms of where we're depositing our money. And we start looking at having that conversation that as our pastoral leadership meet and talk about who is being friendly to our conversations to help guide where those are. Now, in terms of kind of, banks look at that piece of the business. When they give those loans, they factor in those deposits as a part of their business analysis of how they're going to do. So that is a key piece. But again, every bank is not going to get waist deep into community development projects. I mean, there's one particular bank that they want to do owner occupied. They want lawyer offices. They want accountant office. They want that there's certain specific types of loans that they want to fund. And does it make sense to have our financial deposits there as it relates to that? Possibly not. So those are considerations that we think about it. But I'm thankful that we have someone like Community Works at the table that is actively engaged and looking to try and both create the dialogue for this conversation, but is putting its money where its balance sheet is and is funding these types of projects. Tammy has, and personally and with her lenders, doing educational sessions on it, and then looking at how do we make and underwrite those transactions. So we have those resources and partners here, but yes, we do need to think about our depository pieces. That's just a part of it. But there are so many aspects of this that we can get into and certainly hope to on a continual basis. But I appreciate your time, and it's a commitment that at 45 minutes before we started that this room was half full shows a commitment on your behalf. So I applaud you for taking the initiative and the time to come and look at this and explore. It may not be a decision for everyone, but every start where you are and go from there. And let's do it and work together. Thank you.
Another round of applause, please.